Hi. World War I is generally stated to have ended in 1918, when the armistices were signed. However, it's worth noting that that is a very oversimplified version of history. For instance, with the Turkish War of Independence, World War I functionally continued in the east, not too dissimilar to what it had been before, until the early 20s. And Hungary continued fighting France, Serbia, and Romania, the exact people they'd been fighting in World War I, until well into 1919. And so, over the course of 2 years, I made a video series where I talked about all the countries in World War I that had a substantial amount of fighting keep going in it, even after World War I technically ended. So that includes a video about China, a couple about Persia, Germany, Austria, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, the Caucasus, Arabia. I know those last two aren't countries, they're regions. The series eventually snowballed into just a during and after World War I series, because for some of them you can't explain the situation after World War I without explaining the situation during World War I. I also wanted to talk about Greece and Albania, but I never got round to those two, and I probably never will, so if somebody wants to do that, that's great. This is a compilation video of all the videos in this series, and the reason I'm doing this intro is I just want to say that if the first couple of videos seem like very low quality, not very highly produced videos, that's because they are. If you don't like watching low quality videos, you can skip ahead to the higher quality ones, because shockingly my video making skills improve over a couple of years. The first video, which is a 53-minute video about the Russian Revolution, is literally just a black screen with me doing a voiceover and then white text on screen, which is subtitles, so you know what I'm saying. And then in the most recent video, which is about Persia, is high quality animations. I've timestamped all the different videos below, and the second thing I want to say before this video starts is sources. So this video in and of itself does not cite any sources. However, if you want the sources, all the original videos have been linked below, and most of them cite their sources in the description or on screen. So if you want to check the sources or learn more, that's where to go. Alright, thanks for bearing with me through this boring intro. Let's go.
On the morning of the 12th of March, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia controlled an empire spanning tens of millions of square kilometers and over 100 million people. 48 hours later, he had lost control of the entire country. He lost all of that in the time it takes to have a camping trip. That's gotta be some kind of record. In this video, I'll cover the eventful tale of the end of the Romanov dynasty, full of riots, revolution, and betrayal, ending with the abdication of a man who, hours earlier, believed he could control Russia for years to come, finally surrendering his throne as an angry mob mauled his political apparatus piece by piece. Let's get to it! In 1917, in the Russian capital city, the food situation was awful. World War I had raged on the continent for 3 years at this point, and it had gradually ruined the ability of the Russian people to consume food. So, on the 8th of March, protesters flocked to the streets of Petrograd to protest. But they weren't just demanding more food, they wanted regime change. When the protesters took to the streets that day, they yelled slogans such as, "Down with autocracy." In Russia, Tsarism had become so unpopular, the masses wanted it gone. Meanwhile, on the same day, a wage dispute occurred at the Putilov metalworks. The employees claimed that the managers were underpaying them, and in response to that, the workers were locked out of the building and told to back down or they would never be given work again. But being locked out meant the workers had nothing to do. And do you know what people do when they have nothing to do? They overthrow governments. Exactly right. And so, those 20,000 metalworkers with nothing to do joined the protests, bringing the number of protesters up to 90,000. On day 2 of the protests, the number of protesters increased to 197,000. The protesters wanted to reach the city centre, because that's where the aristocracy lived, and they wanted to protest right outside of the aristocracy's houses. They lined up at the banks of the Neva River and got ready to cross, but the police blocked the bridges over the river, so there was no way the people could get across. There was a slight flaw in the police's plan, however, and that was that the river had frozen over, and so the people could just walk across the ice. Once the police had failed to stop the people getting over the river, the Cossacks were called up to disperse the mobs. Just one problem. The Cossacks probably didn't care much about defending the Russian government. Whenever they were sent after the crowds, they did the minimal effort possible. In fact, one time a Cossack regiment straight up refused to attack a crowd of protesters, and the protesters cheered them for not attacking. And the Cossack regiment bowed to them for that. This was not going well for the government. The Tsar wasn't in the capital at the moment. He was in Belarus commanding the war, but he sent a telegram back to the city, ordering the authorities to use any means necessary to crush the dissent. And that meant the use of firearms, which, up until this point, had not been used against the demonstrators. But, on the night of the 10th of March, the Russian officers were informed that tomorrow they would be shooting at protesters. The next morning, Russian soldiers were ordered to fire at the crowds. One unit refused to shoot and mutinied. The mutiny was put down, and no other mutiny happened that day. There was firing on protesters in multiple locations. It seemed that the dynasty would survive this. On the morning of the 12th of March, Captain Lashkovich walked into the barracks of the training detachment of the Volynski Regiment. That morning, in those barracks, the entire course of history was going to be irrevocably altered forever. This detachment had killed more people than any other the day before, so he was going to order them to shoot more protesters. But when Lashkovich walked into the barracks, he was met with cries of, "We will not shoot! We will not shoot! We will not shoot!" Lashkovich wasn't giving up that easily. Remember the telegram the Tsar sent to the city, demanding the protests to be crushed? Well, Lashkovich took out a copy of the telegram and read it out to the barracks. The message was clear. Disobeying the order to attack protesters would mean disobeying an order from the Tsar himself, the highest authority in Russia. Were these soldiers really going to disobey an order from the Tsar himself? And the answer to that question, ladies and gentlemen, was yes. Captain Lashkovich would not walk out of those barracks alive. Either the soldiers killed him, or he shot himself. We don't know, but what we do know is that those troops of the Volynski Regiment stormed out of that building and woke up the soldiers of the Preobrazhensky and Litovsky regiments, who agreed to join their mutiny. Suddenly, there was a significant mutiny with a genuine chance of overthrowing the Tsar. They decided to go to the Vyborg district, an area so revolutionized that the police were too scared to leave the station. The only thing keeping them alive was the fact that they had guns and the workers didn't. But that was about to change. The mutinying soldiers showed up in Vyborg and told the striking workers the location of every single arsenal in the district. And with that, the workers were armed. They hunted down the last holdouts of police and killed them all. And this was a story going on all over the city. Mutiny report after mutiny report after mutiny report piled up on the desks of the Moscow authorities. They put together a force of 6 supposedly loyal companies, but that force disintegrated every time it was sent to fight the revolutionaries. By the end of the day, the rebels controlled the city. All prisoners were released from prison, and the court building was burned. Military high command in Russia dispatched an army under General Ivanov to retake the city, but until they arrived, the Tsar had lost control of Petrograd. With the old regime thrown out, so everybody worth their salt sent representatives to the government building of the Russian Empire, the Tauride Palace. Trade unions, cooperatives and political parties all sent people there to try and get a stake in this new government. In the end, they set up an organization called the Petrograd Soviet. This would act as the city council of Petrograd, and in case you're wondering what their claim to power was, their claim was, "Because I said so." They decided to set up a food commission to regulate the supply of food to the city, and a workers' militia to replace the police force. Meanwhile, also in the Tauride Palace was the Duma. Now the Duma was a government of Russia that had no real power, but the Tsar let it exist anyway because it looked like he was giving up power. The revolutionaries hadn't bothered to attack the Duma during the revolution, and so it was just sitting there in the palace deciding what to do. There were many in the Duma who wanted to create a constitutional monarchy, and others who just wanted a republic without a monarch. The Tsar had sent them an order to dissolve, but there were many in the revolutionary populace who wanted to use the Duma as a building block to form a new government. So the Duma had to decide whose orders to follow, the Tsar's or the people's. In the end, they did both. They officially declared the Duma dissolved, left the room, and met back up in the same building but in a different room as a group of private citizens. The Duma quickly elected a temporary committee to run Russia for the time being. What was their claim to power? Their claim was, "Because I said so." Although it should be noted that the temporary committee had basically no authority anywhere in Russia except for a little bit of power in the capital. True power lay with the aforementioned Petrograd Soviet, which was much more popular. I just want to stress how fast all of this happened. Before dawn, there was no mutiny going on against the government, and most of the city was under their control. By the end of the day, the entire garrison had mutinied. The government had lost complete control of the city, and people were trying to ram together a new government. Up until this point, the Tsar had been in Belarus fighting the war against Germany, but at this point, he decided he should probably return to the vicinity of the capital to see what was going on. His plan was to go to Tsarskoye Selo, a few miles from the city, but he never made it. 100 miles away from the city, he found that the next few stations along were controlled by revolutionaries, so instead, he changed course. He went for Pskov, where the military high command was. There, they discussed the recapture of Petrograd, but it was going to be difficult. The last of the troops in Petrograd that were loyal to the Tsar had deserted that morning. happening. In the city, policemen were queuing up to be arrested to save themselves from the revolutionary mobs. There was no question about it. The revolutionaries had complete control of the city. However, the Duma Committee knew there was still a threat of military attack, so they put together a military commission to restore order in the garrison, and use the garrison to protect the city from loyalists. A week after the first protest started, the revolution spread out of Petrograd. That day, revolution began in the city of Moscow. The entire garrison defected to the side of the revolutionaries. The city fell much easier than Petrograd. It was almost like the government knew they had no chance of holding out. So they gave up, and the revolution spread across the whole country as well. There was very little death and blood. The Duma Committee and Petrograd Soviet just telegrammed everyone to say that the Tsar was no longer in control, and that became true. Few people cared enough to risk their life to defend the autocracy that had oppressed them for hundreds of years. And those who were knew that there was no point trying. The people wanted the Tsar gone, and so did the soldiers. So, the Tsar lost control of the country in a matter of days. And it became clear there was no chance the Tsar could retake the capital. Remember that army that was sent to take back the city? Well, it arrived just a few miles outside the city, and got no further. The loyalist soldiers started mingling with the revolutionary soldiers, and became influenced by them. They decided they didn't want to attack the city anymore. The Russian Tsar looked on in dismay, as his chances of retaking Petrograd withered away. Meanwhile in the city, the Petrograd Soviet, despite being far more popular than the Duma, decided to allow the Duma to form a provisional government to run the country. So they began negotiations with the Duma's temporary committee. In the end, the Duma agreed to the following conditions in exchange for the Petrograd Soviet consenting to the creation of a provisional government. The first condition was that there would be immediate preparations for a general election to elect a government of Russia. Then there would be a bunch of civil rights and freedoms and all that, like free speech and stuff. But there was one condition that piqued my interest. The provisional government would not be allowed to disarm or remove from the city any soldiers that took part in the revolution. This was significant because it would mean that the provisional government would constantly be under threat. You see, it took those troops just a few hours to bring a 300-year dynasty to an end, and they could do it again even faster, and the provisional government would always be much less popular than the Soviet. So, if there was another revolution, then the provisional government was going first. But the Duma Committee had obtained permission from the Soviet to form a government. So, they got ready to declare the new government. The Soviet also decided to greatly reform the military. A bunch of soldiers gathered in a room in the Tauride Palace and had a massive discussion about how to reform the army. They decided that the officers would no longer have control of the weapons. Instead, the soldiers would elect committees that would control the supply of arms. With the Tsar losing increasingly more power, many believed that the monarchy would be saved if the Tsar abdicated in favour of his son. They were convinced that everyone hated the Tsar, but not Tsarism itself. So Russian generals convinced the Tsar to abdicate in favour of his son, and he announced his plans to do exactly that. Then, a speech was given by a member of the Duma Committee in Petrograd, declaring the need for a constitutional monarchy. The speech was a disaster. Everyone hated the idea of keeping the monarchy around. The Tsar changed his plans, and instead abdicated for himself, but also his son as well. Nicholas had woken up that morning, expecting to rule Russia for the rest of his life. Later that night, he abdicated. It was the 9th day since the revolution began, and things were looking bleak for the royal family. With the Tsar abdicating for himself and his son, the only possible candidate to succeed him was his brother, Michael Romanov. Dozens of Duma members gathered in his apartment, half of them begging him to accept the throne and save the Tsars, half of them begging him to decline it. In the end, he declined the throne. The Romanov dynasty was over. Later that day, the provisional government took over the ruling of Russia. However, the provisional government had so little power, it was barely a government. The only reason it had any power was because it was backed by the Petrograd Soviet. On the 21st of March, the Romanov family were detained and sent to house arrest in the Urals. However, just because the Tsar was deposed, it didn't mean that the Russian Revolution was over. You see, in Switzerland, there was a man who'd worked his whole life for a Marxist revolution in Russia and the world. He was beginning to worry that he would not see revolution in his lifetime. He had no money to start a revolution, and no way to get back to Russia to do a revolution. But both problems would be solved when he was approached by the Germans, who wanted to send him back to Russia and give him a bunch of money. Russia was already losing the war against Germany. Now, the Germans were going to hit them with a weapon far more dangerous than any German army: Vladimir Lenin. 1 week after this video releases, there will be a Kahoot quiz live stream about the information in this video, so we'll see who is paying attention then. Remember the information from On the morning of the 12th of March, Captain Lashkevich walked into the barracks of the Volinsky Regiment. There he informed them that morning they were going to be shooting at protesters again. The troops refused. Either they shot him, or Lashkevich committed suicide. Either way, the mutiny had begun. The Volinsky Regiment got to work, recruiting other soldiers to their mutinies, and telling protesters where to find stockpiles of guns. By the end of the day, 160,000 soldiers would be part of the mutiny. By the end of the week, the central government would have lost control of the country. The replacement government that was set up was called the Provisional Government. However, this was barely a government. The workers' militia that had replaced the police force did not like them and could not be counted on to defend the regime if push came to shove. The Russian army did not like them and could not be counted on to defend the regime if push came to shove. They'd overthrown the last government easy peasy apple squashy, and they could do it again. The peasantry all just wanted a slice of their landlord's estate, which the Provisional Government did not want to give them. So the peasants did not like the Provisional Government and could not be counted on to defend the regime if push came to shove. So you may be wondering, how did the Provisional Government even last a week without getting overthrown? Well, it was because of an institution known as the Petrograd Soviet. They were the city council of the capital city of Russia, and they were actually popular. They used their popularity to make people obey the Provisional Government. But if the two governments ever threw hands, then the army would side with the Soviet. Nevertheless, while most places in Russia still had some influence from the Provisional Government, some were just electing councils to run the place without any Provisional Government influence. Meanwhile, on the war front against Germany and Austria, everything was going to hell. The soldiers were losing any and all discipline, disregarding orders from officers, and in some units they murdered people for talking in favour of war. Everyone in Russia wanted the war to end. But Russia had made a bunch of promises to the Allies, and the Provisional Government wanted to keep those promises, and that means they couldn't leave the war. Therefore, instead of leaving the war, they began trying to restore order in their army. Meanwhile, there would be the first of several uprisings against the Provisional Government. On the 1st of May, a letter was sent to the Allied governments saying that the Soviet wanted the Russian people to oppose imperialist aims, as they wanted, quote, peace without annexations or contributions. However, the message came with a note from the Provisional Government attached, saying that Russia did intend to fulfill their obligations to the Allies, and it also said that the desire to continue the war had only flourished with the revolution. This was absolutely not correct, it was a lie. The people were furious. On the 3rd of May, 2 days later, a regiment of Finnish soldiers, fully armed, began demonstrating against this. They demanded the resignation of the guy that wrote that note, even though loads of people agreed to have that note sent. Other units joined in, and pretty soon, there were 25 to 30,000 soldiers demonstrating. And oh my god, I cannot imagine the utter terror felt by the Provisional Government. This was exactly how the Tsar got overthrown. However, shots had not been fired yet, and until they were fired, the government was not doomed yet. If they could keep things from escalating, then maybe everyone would go home. So the people from the Soviet gave a bunch of speeches, and convinced all the soldiers to go back to their barracks, and they all lived happily ever after. Until the next day, when more demonstrations occurred, this time by civilians and not by soldiers. They started off with demonstrations against Malyukov, the leader of the Cadet Party, the last non-socialist party in the government. He was also the guy who wrote that note. There were then a bunch of counter-demonstrations in favour of Malyukov. Garrison Commander Kornilov suggested they use force to crush this dissent. The government was more pragmatic, telling him to stand down. But just in case, he did order some units to mobilise anyway, to stand guard, just in case. And you'll never guess how those units reacted to those orders. The soldiers asked the Soviet whether or not they should follow that order. The Soviet responded by decreeing that no soldiers should be out on the street unless they said so or unless it was a routine operation. And the soldiers obeyed that order. After a couple of days, the protests stopped and everybody went home. With disaster averted, the Provisional Government agreed to put together a new cabinet. The Cadet Party, mentioned earlier, agreed to join this new cabinet under a few conditions. Notably, that the government agreed upon an offensive against Germany. Currently, their army was in a terrible state. Soldiers were deserting home in droves. The Russian army was collapsing. A successful offensive, the cadets believed, would halt or slow the disintegration of the army, which is a good idea, until you remember that the army was disintegrating in droves, and in some units, it was dangerous to speak in favour of launching an offensive. Minister for War, Alexander Kerensky, went round the army giving speeches to boost morale, which did work because he was so good, but as soon as he left, all morale in the Russian army went with him. The offensive began on the 1st of July, and there was some initial success, as the Austrians were demoralised, but then the Germans showed up to reinforce the Austrians, and everything went to heck. The offensive was intended to save the Russian war effort. It had the opposite effect. The failure of the offensive pushed the Russians out of Austrian territory entirely and sped up the disintegration of the army. Then, in the capital city, there was a revolution against the government. If you want to see how that plays out, click on this video, appearing on the end screen now.
It was the summer of 1917, and the Russian government was extremely unpopular. They had just launched a disastrous offensive on the Galician front that was supposed to boost morale if it succeeded, but it failed, and so now the entire Russian army was deserting in droves. In the wake of this disaster, among other reasons, the Russian Prime Minister and 4 of his cabinet ministers resigned. So with the Russian government just absolutely imploding, the people of Russia wondered if there was anybody who could replace them. The provisional government wasn't the only government in Russia. There was also a Soviet, which was essentially the city council of Russia, but effectively it had just as much, if not more, power than the provisional government. What if, the people thought, that we could give all power to the Petrograd Soviet and the other city Soviets around Russia? That was even a Bolshevik slogan, all power to the Soviets. And the Bolsheviks were also gaining in popularity. They got 54% of the seats in the workers' section of the Petrograd Soviet, but they still didn't have a majority in the soldiers' section. So, some soldiers in Russia began planning armed demonstrations in favour of all power being given to the Soviets and taken away from the provisional government. Certain machine gunners went to other units to try to convince them to help them plan the armed uprising, and the Bolsheviks knew they had to stop this. You see, if these armed demonstrations did occur, then they could well escalate into a revolt. And the Bolsheviks knew that if this escalated into a revolt, then it would be bad news for them. You see, at least quite a lot of the people in these revolts would be calling not for the Soviet to take full power, but for the Bolsheviks to take full power. And why would this be a bad thing? Well, it's very simple. The Bolsheviks could have probably taken control of Petrograd if they wanted to. They were popular enough in the city that they could do that. But why didn't they? Because they were popular in Petrograd, but that's not the only place in Russia. The rest of Russia would turn against them, and the city would be besieged, and it would fall. The Bolsheviks didn't revolt yet because they weren't popular enough to do so. So the Bolsheviks sent people out to tell these troops not to join the armed demonstrations. A massive propaganda battle was waged throughout the day. Bolshevik representatives were sent out, giving speeches to the soldiers, telling them, do not join this armed protest that is being planned. But hotter heads prevailed, and by the 16th of July, armed demonstrations were occurring in the capital city of Russia in favour of all power to the Soviets. Soldiers and workers both took part in these protests. The Bolsheviks realised that they couldn't stop these protests, and so instead they urged all those protesting soldiers and workers to go straight to the Tauride Palace where the provisional government was and present their demands there. Other protesting workers and soldiers besieged the headquarters of the Petrograd Soviet and said, no, you are going to take power, and if you refuse to take power, we will make you take power, okay? They weren't asking the Soviet to become in charge of Russia. They weren't allowing the Soviet to become in charge of Russia. They were telling the Soviet, you're going to be in charge of Russia. But yet the Soviets still continually refused to take power. The government was helpless. All the soldiers in the city were either joining the protests and mutinying or refusing to defend the government. Their only hope was if loyalist units could return from the front and save them from certain doom. Supposedly, one of the protesting workers even yelled at a member of the Soviet saying, take power when it is offered to you, you son of a bitch! I didn't even know that word had a direct translation from English to Russian. There were many in the city who were calling for the active overthrow of the provisional government, and this could happen at any time. They simply had to organise all these spontaneous protests and riots into an organised force where they could storm the Tauride Palace and arrest the provisional government. They could do it at any time if they could get organised and get together. A day after the uprising started, on the 17th of July, 20,000 revolutionary soldiers from the island of Kronstadt arrived in the city to support the rebellion. They went to Lenin's house and expected him to give a massive, rousing speech advocating the complete overthrow of the provisional government and putting the Bolsheviks in charge. Okay, these people weren't, all power to the Soviets. These people were in favour of all power to the Bolsheviks. Yet here's the thing, Lenin had a dilemma. Remember how earlier I said that if Lenin took power, all the people in Russia would team up and get rid of him? Exactly! Lenin knew that he couldn't use this to take advantage of this and overthrow the government, because that just wouldn't work. It was a doomed uprising where he would lose, but if he didn't overthrow the government and try to take control of Russia, he would also lose, because the Bolsheviks were going to get blamed for these protests. Many in the protests were Bolshevik supporters, and they were marching under Bolshevik slogans such as peace, land, bread, and all power to the Soviets. Therefore, if the provisional government survived, the Bolsheviks were going to get the blame for it. So there's going to be like a massive wave of anti-Bolshevik suppression. Lenin lost either way. Lenin, however, decided that his party could survive a wave of suppression. It could not, however, survive the entirety of Russia turning against them. So when he gave that speech to the 20,000 Kronstadt sailors, he was more restrained than they expected them to be, and it was disappointing. The crowd dispersed at the end. And remember how I said that they could have taken control of the government building? Had they tried? Well, that's the thing. They didn't try because this was completely disorganised. There was no way to organise all these groups into a coherent structure enough to storm the palace. There was no plan to storm the palace, and so they didn't. So eventually, loyalist units arrived from the front, and all the rebels either got bored and went home, or they got crushed by loyalist units. The revolution had failed. And now Lenin had another dilemma. You see, he had just been accused of being a German agent. You know, as that wave of anti-Bolshevik suppression after the rebellion that I just mentioned. So he had to decide. Was he going to escape to Finland and not be put on trial? But that would imply that he was guilty if he was escaping. Or would he allow himself to be put on trial in the hope that the jury would acquit him? Well, he decided to escape to Finland to not get exiled, not get arrested, because he knew that there was little to no chance of getting a fair trial. Remember that offensive I mentioned at the start of the video? Well, Kerensky, the guy that organised that offensive, was made Prime Minister after this, and so Kerensky, as Prime Minister, decided to restore the death penalty in the Russian army, at least on the front. But the death penalty only became legal in theory. It was still not going to be tolerated among the soldiers. He also denied Finland's declaration of independence, and he resigned all his positions, but everybody begged him to come back, and so he said, okay, I'll come back, under the condition that I'm allowed to choose whoever I want to be in my cabinet. He also arrested several Bolshevik leaders, you know, for being German agents. The Bolsheviks had to go semi-underground for a bit after this. So in the next part of this series on the Russian Revolution, I am going to make a video about how the Bolsheviks overthrow the Russian government. And if you would like to see that, I'm going to put it on the end screen when I make the video, okay? Hi. Not sure if you saw the gunshot, it was quite fast. Anyway, in July of 1917, in the capital city of Russia, Petrograd, there was a revolt. And when I say revolt, I mean a disorganised mass of protests, aiming to overthrow the provisional government of Russia. These protests failed because the people that they wanted to be in charge of Russia refused to be in charge of Russia. So I suppose they all just either went home or got crushed by reactionary forces. But anyway, in the aftermath of this revolt, a guy called Kornilov was promoted to the supreme commander of the Russian army. But he only accepted this position under the condition that the government not be allowed to interfere with his commands. Then, when he became in charge of the Russian army, he immediately set up some of his cavalry in a place that wouldn't make much sense if you were going to war with the Germans, which they were at war with the Germans, but it would make quite a lot of sense if you were planning to launch an attack on, say, Moscow or Petrograd. This guy was plotting something. You see, this guy absolutely hated the Petrograd Soviet, which was officially the city council of Petrograd, but in practice it was like a sort of joint government, co-government with the provisional government, because that's how powerful it was. And he also hated the Bolshevik Party, and he was just itching for an excuse to march into Petrograd and eliminate the Soviet, eliminate the Bolshevik Party, hang Vladimir Lenin, hang all the leaders. He was more than willing to hang all the leaders of the Petrograd Soviet, or the Bolshevik Party. But here's the thing, he wanted to wait for provocation first, you know. There'd been a revolution in July, what if there was another revolution? And when the other revolution came, he was going to be ready. And he was going to go in, use that revolution as justification, and defeat the Bolsheviks. And this guy claimed not to want anything for himself, of course. He just wanted to save Russia from the evil Soviet. And we don't know whether or not this was true. Maybe, if he succeeded, it would have been a military dictatorship. Or maybe he genuinely just wanted to save Russia. We'll never know. He also thought maybe that instead of fighting my way to the capital, I can simply get the provisional government to let me into the capital. So he sent Kerensky a long list of demands that would have effectively given him complete control of the capital city of Russia. And so Kerensky read these demands and realised, oh my god, I probably shouldn't have promoted this guy. This guy's absolutely plotting something. He immediately sent Kerensky a telegram telling him that he was fired and asking his chief of staff to take command. But his chief of staff refused to take command instead. So, guess what happened? Kerensky realised he had to launch his coup now. So, he ordered his cavalry to march on Petrograd. But here's the thing. No one in Russia supported him. Or barely anybody in Russia supported him. The train station workers refused to send trains full of Kornilov's troops to the capital, and every time he arrived at a train station, his troops would be surrounded by loyal soldiers and loyal workers, loyal to the government that is, yelling at his troops, "Don't attack the city! Call off the coup! Don't do it!" They were encouraging his troops to either desert or defect or launch a mutiny or something, and all that yelling and propaganda had an effect. Lots of his troops did end up, deserting. Propagandists also infiltrated his army to try and convince his soldiers to desert, and that worked as well. Kornilov was losing a lot of men to desertion, and he wasn't getting any closer to the capital because, like I said, the train station workers weren't sending his troops there. And also, the telegraph workers also weren't transmitting the commands of his generals, so communication in Kornilov's army was just terrible. Meanwhile, in the capital city, the Soviet, who knew that Kornilov was probably coming for them, went to Kerensky and demanded that Kerensky completely and unconditionally crush Kornilov's revolt. The Bolsheviks also wanted to help put down this coup, so they were able to get the approval of several other political parties to rearm and re-legalise the Red Guard. The Red Guard was the defence military detachment of the Bolsheviks. And so now the Bolsheviks were armed. But it didn't really matter that the Bolsheviks were armed, because no fighting would be necessary against Kornilov. Every single one of his troops just deserted without a shot being fired. Remember all those people who were surrounding Kornilov's army and yelling at them? Infiltrating his troops, convincing them to desert? Yeah, that worked. Kornilov's army just melted away. But the coup still had a lot of consequences. It was great for the Bolsheviks, because now, not only did the Bolsheviks have their Red Guard armed and re-legalised, but also they'd become so much more popular. Quite a lot of that propagandising the workers to desert, and having the telegraph workers not transmit the communications, and having all those railroad workers not send the trains further, well, quite a lot of that had been orchestrated by the Bolsheviks. They'd convinced the workers to do that. I mean, not all of it was orchestrated by the Bolsheviks, obviously, but the Bolsheviks did also get their Red Guard ready to defend the city. It means the Bolsheviks are so much more popular. And what does that mean? It means that the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets, the two most important cities in Russia, elected a Bolshevik majority. So next week I'm going to release, part 5, I think? Yeah, I think it is part 5. Next week I'm going to release part 5 of my Russian Revolution series. And it'll probably be on the October Bolshevik Revolution, unless I find something else to talk about that came between September and November. Still, stick around for that. Bye. The year was 1917, and the Russian Revolution was well underway. With the Eastern Front drawing troops away from the Western Front, everybody could see that Russia was about to completely change the entire course of history forever. Workers were seizing control of their factories. Peasants were murdering their landlord. Soldiers were in mutiny. One Russian general launched a military coup, and it failed. Most people believed that this military coup would have no long-term effects on the world. But when the coup failed, one man realised that now was his time to strike. You see, the Bolshevik Party took much of the credit for the failure of the coup, and so their popularity skyrocketed. In 3 months, they went from the 4th to the most popular party in Moscow. Vladimir Lenin could see the writing on the wall. It was now or never. So preparations began.
the Bolsheviks went to the Petrograd Soviet and told them that they wanted to form the Military Revolutionary Committee, with the objective of doing a military revolution. The Petrograd put together this committee with the intention of overthrowing the provisional government. This committee was mostly dominated by the Bolsheviks, but there were 12 socialist revolutionaries and 4 anarchists. As they began plotting revolution, the first thing the MRC had to think about was the Petrograd garrison. Calling them a garrison makes them sound more violent than they actually were. There was only one circumstance in which this garrison could, be reliably counted on to fight somebody.
Okay, everybody, great news. We are going to be sending you to the front. You're telling us that you want us to push our lives at risk. That's right. You're going to have to actually go to war and fight some Germans. How does that sound?
Despite the fact that they didn't know how reliable the garrison was going to be in the revolution, they still decided it was worth getting the garrison on side. So they asked a bunch of people from the garrison, and most of the soldiers agreed to join the revolution. So, the MRC declared that it had full control over the garrison, and sent people out to take command. They also declared that no high command order was valid unless it was signed by the Military Revolutionary Committee. The garrison commander, Colonel Polkovnikov, could not accept this and chose not to recognise MRC control over the garrison. To the garrison, the next thing the MRC had to think about was the Peter and Paul Fortress. This Peter and Paul Fortress had so many guns in it. Whoever could control that arsenal had a massive advantage. So, Trotsky went over to the fortress and gave a huge speech, and that was all it took. The entire Peter and Paul Fortress switched over to the side of the revolution. The Military Revolutionary Committee was winning. Until now, the provisional government had been confident that they could crush the Bolshevik revolt. Suddenly, they realised everything was going to hell for them. Workers from the factories were getting trained by the Bolsheviks and the MRC to fight with a rifle, and then joining the force known as the Red Guards. On the eve of the revolution, the Military Revolutionary Committee had an estimated 20,000 Red Guards at its disposal. The government looked at the situation with terror and began to take action. First, they sent troops to a Bolshevik printing shop and shut down the Bolsheviks' newspaper. The Military Revolutionary Committee was quick to react. They sent troops, retook the shop, and by 11 AM that same day, the newspaper was back on. The pro-Bolshevik cruiser Aurora was ordered to evacuate the city and leave to the Baltic Sea. But, under orders from the MRC, the cruiser stayed. The next day, revolution began. More pro-Bolshevik cruisers were brought into the city. Key buildings were occupied by the Red Guards, and telephone lines were cut. The Red Guards took control of the entire capital city of Russia in one day. There was so little fighting, because very few people actually cared to fight for the provisional government. Only 5 revolutionary sailors and 1 Red Guard died. Think about that for 1 second. The entirety of human history from that point on has just been completely changed, with no way of turning it back. And only 6 people had to die. Here's the thing. As long as there was a revolution, there must be a counter-revolution. And in Russia, there was no different. Former premier of the pro-government, Kerensky, fled the capital city of Russia after the revolution and found the Russian army. There he met Russian General Krasny. Krasny put together an army, and together the pair hopped on a train and went back to Petrograd. They were going to retake the city and end this Bolshevik revolution almost before it began. The Bolsheviks had taken the city without a fight. Now they were going to have to fight tooth and claw to keep it. And it was 1917 in Russia, and the country was rapidly falling under Bolshevik control. The Red Guards were launching coups all over the country, taking control of city after city after city. On the 5th, Tallinn fell. On the 7th, Petrograd, Minsk, Novgorod, and 2 other cities all fell to successful Bolshevik coups. On the 8th, 4 more cities became under Bolshevik control. But perhaps there was one chance of preventing the Bolsheviks from conquering Russia. After the Bolshevik Revolution in Petrograd, the premier, Alexander Kerensky, fled the city and met up with commander of the Northern Front, General Cheremissov.
Cheremisov, the Bolsheviks are taking over the country. We have to go back to Petrograd right now and occupy the city. Oh, I'm sorry. Aren't you the guy who chose not to make me Supreme Commander of the entire Russian army? Yeah, sorry, the army doesn't meddle in political affairs. Political affairs? This is a revolution! This is what the army's for! God damn it, why do I pay you? Not anymore, you former world leader. I'll help you. Really? Yeah, well, I'll go get my division together, we'll hop on a train, go straight back to Petrograd. Oh, thank God you're a lifesaver. Hopefully not to the Bolsheviks, though. So there it was. Kerensky, Krasnov, and 700 Cossacks were barreling down a train straight towards Petrograd. If they won, Vladimir Lenin would be merely a chapter in the history books. If they lost, he'd be a bookshelf. The stakes were high, but apparently, apathy among the Russian army was higher. So most of my soldiers either didn't want to fight the Bolsheviks, or they were too far away to be reached. I was only able to get you 700 men. But 700? The Bolsheviks have tens of thousands of troops in the city. Yeah, well, we've lost battles, we've outnumbered the enemy several times to one. The Bolsheviks can lose battles like that too. You're the worst motivational speaker ever. They had the train driver turn the train up at full speed. That way, when they went through the train station, the Bolsheviks couldn't stop them. On the 9th of November, they occupied the city of Gatchina. There, they asked for recruits to join them. Their only chance of winning was for troops to join them against the Bolsheviks. But all the recruits they got amounted to several officers, which contributed 2 planes to drop propaganda over Petrograd, and 1 armoured car. Not nearly enough. The exact same day that Krasnov took Gatchina, 5 more cities fell under Bolshevik control. 10th of November, Krasnov advanced on Tsarskoye Selo, a few miles away from Petrograd. His artillery fired 2 shells into the city, and that was enough to scare off the Bolshevik garrison. Marching into the city, they met the 16,000-strong Tsarskoye Selo garrison. If this garrison agreed to join them, they would have enough troops to win the war. But it was not to be. The garrison declared neutrality. It seemed that nobody wanted to join Kerensky. Krasnov may have taken over Tsarskoye Selo, but on the exact same day, Rostov and 2 other cities fell under Bolshevik control. Not only that, but the new regime was getting ready for the attack. Workers poured out of their factories to take the day off and dig trenches in the outskirts of Petrograd, setting up barbed wire. Trotsky then began filling those trenches with his Red Guards. It seemed that Kerensky and Krasnov's coup was doomed from the beginning. They had no infantry, just Cossacks who rode horses. But when all hope seemed lost, there was one last ray of hope for Kerensky. And no, I'm holding up 2 fingers. The Junkers. The Junkers were officers in training. These people wanted to launch a revolution and take back control of the city from the Bolsheviks. They broke into a garage and seized some armoured cars. They seized the central telephone exchange, taking control of all communications in the city. I don't know if Krasnov knew that there was a revolution going on in the city. Presumably they must have told him in advance, but regardless of whether or not he knew, he didn't make any move to attack Petrograd and support the uprising, which is a shame because attacking Petrograd on that day might have been his only chance of winning the battle, if there was ever any chance of winning the battle. But here's the thing, the evening before the Junker coup began, a guy was walking about with a detailed copy of the mutiny's plans on him. The Bolsheviks caught that guy, read the plans, and now knew every single move that the Junkers were going to make before they made them. And so, the telephone exchange was retaken, and then all the schools were laid siege to and occupied. The Bolsheviks taught those students exactly what it was like to go to school in America. 400 people were killed and wounded during the storming of just one of those schools. We now move to the 12th of November, 5 days after the Bolsheviks took control of Russia. On that day, Smolensk and 2 other cities came under Bolshevik power. It was also the day that Krasnov finally decided to launch his attack on Petrograd. His 700 Cossacks assaulted the Pulkovo Heights just outside the city. His advance was slowed by a marsh that they had to cross, and significant Red Guard forces were deployed to his flanks to outflank him. And on top of that, the Tsarskoye Selo garrison of 16,000 people threatened to attack his men if they didn't cease fighting. Krasnov was forced to withdraw his forces. He ordered a retreat back to Gatchina,
out of Tsarskoye Selo. The Cossacks decided to hand Kerensky over to the Bolsheviks. Kerensky was forced to disguise himself as a sailor and sneak into exile. Kerensky would spend the next couple of decades moving between France and the USA, spending a year in Australia when his second wife died. He would spend the last 25 years of his life in the USA, teaching history and giving lectures. Could you imagine being a former head of state of Russia? Spending your golden years teaching history in the USA? He would die in 1970, aged 89. Kerensky may not have won the war, but he outlived Vladimir Lenin by 46 years. He was never arrested by the Bolsheviks, but he was released. He went south and became ruler of the Don Republic. He would become a commander in the Russian Civil War. But after the White Movement was defeated, he lived in exile for the next 20 years. He would support Nazi Germany during Operation Barbarossa, in which he organised Cossacks against the Soviet Union. The communist authorities would capture him a second time. He was not fortunate enough to be released. Krasanov's army of Cossacks would lose military discipline and most of them would end up deserting. Over the next few days, Tambov, Orel, Perm, Pskov, Moscow and Baku would fall to Bolshevik coups. But despite all this success, Bolshevik victory was not guaranteed. They were still losing a war against Germany, and the Russian army was completely collapsing. Hundreds of thousands of men were deserting home in droves back to their farm just to murder their landlord. Russia was losing war to the Central Powers, and their entire armed forces was collapsing. People were rising up all over Russia to stop the Bolsheviks. During the time of the provisional government, Ukraine had declared autonomy. Now, they declared complete independence. Lenin had to make peace with Germany so he and Trotsky could focus on the civil war that everybody knew was about to start. The next video in my Russian Revolution series will be out 1 week from today. Before dawn on the 12th of March, a Russian officer walked into his barracks to give orders. But little did he know that he would not survive for the next 30 minutes. The Russian Revolution had begun. The emperor of the largest country in the world was overthrown so fast that people blinked and missed it. There was a second revolution in July, which failed. Then there was a military coup in September, which failed. And the Bolsheviks took much of the credit for defeating that military coup. So they surged in popularity and decided that it was time for them to launch their own revolution. So they did. There was a coup in Tallinn, a coup in Petrograd, and a coup in Moscow. Many people believe that the October Revolution was just one revolution. And within a matter of days, much of European Russia was under Bolshevik control. The Bolsheviks sent a delegation to negotiate peace with Germany, and then they lost an election. So they used their substantial military force to make sure they stayed in power anyway. With their position in power briefly secured, they now had to deal with rebel groups rising up against them. A few months prior, Ukraine had declared autonomy. Now, they were declaring full independence. So, a Bolshevik force departed from Kharkov to take Kiev. Due to the numerous workers' revolutions in Ukraine, the Bolsheviks were able to take town after town after town. The Ukrainian army fell back to Kiev in time to crush rebellion, but the city fell to the Red Guards. So with that, it seemed Bolshevism had won. They had taken over Ukraine, but the defeated Ukrainian army was returning to the city, and they brought with them the armies of the German Empire and Austria-Hungary. You see, Ukraine had concluded a peace treaty with the Central Powers. One of the terms of that treaty was that the German Empire would kick the Bolsheviks out of Ukraine. So in they went. The Soviet government in Ukraine fled across the Dnieper faster than a very fast thing. Germany occupied all of Ukraine, with its military becoming the de facto government. And that wasn't the only problem suffered by the Bolsheviks. A Cossack named Alexei Kaledin became ruler of the Don region, and he offered sanctuary to anybody opposing the Bolsheviks. Meanwhile, a group of Tsarist generals announced that they were forming a volunteer army to, quote, defend the people of South and Southeastern Russia. As recruits started flowing in, they quickly went from 0 to 3,000 men. The Bolshevik army was dispatched to deal with these problems. Kaledin was defeated, the Tsarists were sent running. The volunteer army decided to join the Cossack forces, holding out in Ekaterinodar. But by the time they arrived there, the Cossacks had fled, and the city had fallen to the Bolsheviks. The volunteer army was able to establish communication with the surviving Cossacks. Together, they agreed to unite their two forces and attempt to retake Ekaterinodar. Their 9,000 men assaulted 30,000 Bolshevik troops in the city. The fighting lasted 4 days. Even their leader, General Kornilov, was killed. The survivors of the volunteer army relocated to the Don, where thousands more Cossacks joined their ranks, and thousands more went into open revolt against the Bolsheviks. As Germany occupied Rostov, Lenin realized he had lost control of the Don region. In just a couple of months, the Bolsheviks had gone from almost certainly going to become the government of Russia to getting beaten bloody in Ukraine by Germany and getting pummeled in the Caucasus by Cossacks. Romania then invaded and annexed Bessarabia. Soon, this civil war would escalate to the point where all of Siberia was going to war against the Bolsheviks, and white troops were 300 miles from Moscow. This was the Russian Civil War, a war which would kill almost 9 million people, and I would argue had just as great an effect on the outcome of history as the First World War. Come back next week for the next installment in the Russian Revolution series.
Well, the year is 1918, and Russia is being carved up. Germany rips from them Ukraine, parts of Belarus, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. But the troubles weren't over yet. Hi, this is Editing Ben. I just want to apologise in advance for the French horn in the background. My brother's playing it. The Bolshevik Party, newly ruling Russia, couldn't simply get to taking back Ukraine and all those other places they lost. No. You see, there were multiple armies rising against them. First, we have the Volunteer Army in the Caucasus. They were a group of Tsarists ready to take back the country from Bolshevism. They launched their attack on Yekaterinodar and they were defeated. But then they launched another attack a few months later, and this one succeeded. Gradually, they took over the entirety of the North Caucasus, and by the beginning of 1919, they were ready to launch a northward offensive. In the east, the Czechoslovakian Legion, which had been fighting for Russia during the First World War, had been permitted to leave. It was going all the way around the world to France, and then back to Czechoslovakia. But on the way home, they fell out with the Bolsheviks. Battles and skirmishes began between them, and the situation escalated massively. Pretty soon, the Czechoslovakians weren't even going back to Vladivostok anymore. They were going to Moscow, as they occupied the entire Trans-Siberian Railway, the most significant piece of infrastructure in all of Russia. And this great victory inspired millions, or at least hundreds of thousands, of people to join the White Movement against the Bolshevik Party. Pretty soon, those groups of people united to form an anti-Bolshevik government ruling the vast majority of Russia. Finally, in Estonia, well, the people there had just finished fighting a brutal war of independence from both Germany and Russia. Estonia allowed a man called Yudenich, who was a former general of Tsarist Russia, to build up an army there, ready for an attack on Moscow. So now, we have three groups of people opposing the Bolsheviks. In the south, we have the Volunteer Army under General Denikin, planning a three-pronged offensive to take Moscow. In the east, we have a Russian government under Kolchak, planning another offensive against the Bolsheviks. In the northwest, we have Yudenich, planning his offensive to take Petrograd. In 1919, all three of these armies would assault the Bolshevik positions. Tune into part 3 of this video series to see a major war erupt all over Russia. A war so brutal, a historian could go back in time and mistake one of the battles there for a battle in World War I. Welcome to the Russian Civil War. The year was 1919, and Red Russia was under attack from all sides. In the east, the Russian state under Admiral Kolchak began its offensive, with an intent of destroying the new regime once and for all. They stormed into the city of Ufa, but their success wouldn't last. Bolshevism retook the city pretty quickly, and they went on the offensive, pushing the White Army back. From then on, it was all downhill. Meanwhile, in the south, Denikin ordered a three-pronged assault to take the Bolshevik positions. One of his generals, General Wrangel, fought the Bolsheviks at the Battle of, get this, Velikonoyazkraya. They've changed the place name now, but at the time the town was called Velikonoyazkraya. After seeing some success, they were ordered to move further north and converge on the city of Moscow. The Ukrainian anarchists and the Russian Bolsheviks at this time had been fighting each other, so they were caught completely off guard when the White Army stormed up north, and both of them got pushed back. Denikin's forces pushed them up to the Dnieper River and crossed it. The Bolsheviks were pushed back towards Moscow and got within 300 miles of the city. Meanwhile in the north, the third offensive began, as General Yudenich, who'd been building up his forces in Estonia, finally stormed across the border and made for St. Petersburg. Military reinforcements that were desperately needed to fight Denikin were sent to the north to fight Yudenich. By the time Yudenich arrived in St. Petersburg, he was outnumbered 3-1 and he was forced to pull back to Estonia. When he arrived back in Estonia, the Estonian army immediately disarmed him and signed a peace treaty with the Bolsheviks. Most of his men went into exile. In the south, despite getting so close to St. Petersburg, Denikin, with his invasion of Ukraine, had overstretched his forces way too much. And now it was coming back to bite him. 100,000 new recruits and conscripts were sent to reinforce the Bolshevik army. And that was it. No hope left for him. Denikin was pushed back by the Bolsheviks and the anarchists, all the way out of Russia and back to just Crimea. As Denikin resigned, his last few men got ready to hold out. In the east, Kolchak had lost control of his government and had been executed. But here's the thing. There was still a threat to the Bolshevik regime, that threat being Poland. They had invaded Ukraine in the west. Tune in next week to see Bolshevism fight off Poland, Wrangel, and Semenov. Goodbye. The destruction of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is one of the most important events in all of human history. Without it, there would be no Anschluss, no partition of Czechoslovakia, and no Yugoslavia. Despite this, the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is rarely discussed in detail. They normally say, oh yeah, lost a war, they were multi-ethnic and so all the nationalities declared independence, and then Hungary asked the revolution thing. But they never take the time to explain in detail how Europe went from this to this in a matter of months. This video then shall attempt to give you a full timeline, in as much detail as possible, of the destruction of the Habsburg Empire. 636 years of Habsburg rule in Eastern Europe. In 1915, the Balkans fell to the Central Powers, and Serbian troops evacuated their lands. But, in 1917, Greece joined the war against the Central Powers. Suddenly, Serbia was back for round 2. After defeating Bulgaria, a combined French-Serbian force launched an offensive straight up through Serbia, and, on the 1st of November, they retook the capital city of Belgrade. Now, Serbian troops stopped to rest for a minute. Okay, 28th of October. Czechoslovakia declares independence. Also 28th to 31st of October, the Aster Revolution happens in Hungary, which puts a guy called Count Karoli in charge of the country as they declare independence from Austria-Hungary. And Austria-Hungary without Hungary is just sort of Austria, so that kind of meant the end of Austria-Hungary at that point. Meanwhile, the Croatian parliament votes to cease all ties with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the intention of this declaration of independence isn't full independence, but to unite with Serbia and Montenegro. That's their long-term goal, to unite with Serbia and Montenegro. Meanwhile, on the 1st of November, Serbia recaptures Belgrade, and the plan is to send a few dozen Serbian troops into Austria-Hungary, just so they can say they've invaded Austria-Hungary. So they come up with a plan. They're going to send in a few dozen volunteers into areas of Austria-Hungary that are really pro-Serbian, and so there won't be much civil resistance. And if, and only if, the enemy withdraws quickly, will they send in the proper Serbian army, because the proper Serbian army has to be rested after, marching all the way here from Greece. And the orders are to only advance as far as they can be easily supplied. But then they realised something. Hungary had just declared independence. But not only that, but the new government in Hungary had recalled 1.2 million troops from the front, in the hopes that the Allies would be more lenient if they showed that they were less aggressive. Tiny Serbia was a country on the border of massive Austria-Hungary, yet they were at a point where their military was stronger than Austria-Hungary. They had an opportunity to annihilate that major nation, so it would never be a threat to Serbia again, and they could even get more land in the process. This was an opportunity
that a tiny country like Serbia only gets once in 1,000 years. If ever. Actually, this isn't a once in 1,000 years opportunity. This is like a once opportunity, pretty much. So the orders changed. Suddenly, the Serbian army was getting no rest. No longer was the plan to advance as far as they could easily be supplied. The plan was to advance as far and as hard as possible. So in early November, a combined French-Serbian force poured into the southern region of the Habsburg realms. On the 1st of November, West Ukraine declares independence and the Banat Republic is proclaimed. 3rd of November, armistice signed between Austria, Hungary and the Allies. 4th November, Kamansa Republic, I don't know how to pronounce it, Kamansa Republic was declared, and it wanted to unite with West Ukraine. Also on the 4th of November, Italy occupies the Tyrol. And remember how in Prague, Czechoslovakia declared independence in October? Well, in early November, they deployed their armies to take control of Slovakia. You know, Czechoslovakia, without the Slovakia, is just Czechia. So, yeah, well, they had to conquer Slovakia, obviously, so off they went. And then there were skirmishes between Czechoslovakian and Hungarian troops. 10th of November. Now, Romania had left the war in 1917. However, it rejoined on the 10th of November, literally one day before the armistice got signed, because it wanted to make sure it could get as much land as possible. It had already taken Bessarabia from Russia. Now it was planning on taking Transylvania from Hungary. On the 12th of November, Austria is declared a republic, meaning the last land controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire is now no longer controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They're gone. They're gone. On the 13th of November, the Romanian army begins its advance into Transylvania. Also on the 13th, Montenegro agrees to unite with Serbia. Meanwhile, remember the Banat Republic? Well, on the 15th of November, Serbian troops arrived at the gate of its capital city, Timisoara. They had invaded 2 days earlier, but they'd only arrived at the capital city 2 days later. Anyway, now they're going to siege the capital city. Now, Serbia wants to control the entirety of the Banat Republic, but given that there's more than double the amount of Romanians as Serbians in there, well, Romania's going to try claim it as well, because there's so many Romanians there. 28th November, Bukovina agrees to join Romania. 1st of December, Transylvania joins Romania. And on the 1st of December, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes is created, uniting Serbia, Montenegro, and, well, the Yugoslav areas of Austria-Hungary. 5th of December, the Lemko-Rusin Republic is formed, with the intention of uniting with Russia. When it becomes obvious that that's impossible, they ask to unite with Czechoslovakia. This republic survived for 2 years before it got conquered by Poland in 1920. December 6th, a demarcation line is drawn between Slovakia and Hungary. January 23rd, a couple months later, a war begins between Czechoslovakia and Poland over this bit of land here. In the end, they would end up splitting the land between them. However, Poland was lucky because militarily, Czechoslovakia crushed them. Poland lost half their force, Czechoslovakia lost barely any. January 24th, a day after the Czechoslovakian-Polish War began, Poland conquered that Kamansa Republic, remember? That wanted to unite with West Ukraine. And West Ukraine itself in 1920 would officially get annexed by Poland. And then we get into the Hungarian-Romanian War. Basically, Karolyi and his government resigned as rulers of Hungary, and they were replaced by the Communist Party under Bela Kun. The Communist Party came to power promising to take back all Hungary's lost territory. So they immediately invade Transylvania to try to take it back from Romania. The invasion fails, and Romania pushes them back for a while until eventually they manage to halt the Romanian advance. They also come under attack by Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia and also France. Under attack from 3 sides, the Hungarian Red Army launches an attack north into Slovakia, cutting off the Romanians from the Czechoslovakians. Then they begin planning an offensive to take Ruthenia, but then they made a mistake. What they should have done was declared their new conquered land a part of Hungary. I mean, they've just retaken some of the land that Hungary lost, right? That's the reason everyone supported them. So it would have been a massive morale boost on the home front if they'd declared it a part of Hungary, and it would have gained them a bunch of support and possibly new recruits. Instead, Slovakia was declared a puppet state, which is not the same thing, and suddenly everyone was furious at the government for letting Slovakia be independent. Well, not independent, but you know what I mean, not be a part of Hungary. This decrease in the support for the Communist Party was partially what allowed the Czechoslovakians to retake their lost land. The Hungarians then launched an offensive against Romania, which failed, and the Romanians took over Budapest. With the Communists overthrown, a non-communist government became in charge of Hungary, and after 2 peace treaties that ended World War I, the borders of the Balkans were fixed at this. And you know what this meant? It now meant there was no longer a great power in Central Europe. It means that the Soviet Union no longer had a great power to curb its expansion. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Good night. It was the autumn of 1918, and it had become clear that Germany could not win the war. So, the government resigned, and the new government began exchanging peace notes with the Allies. But the German High Command simply could not accept that Germany had been defeated. So, they began planning one last all-out attack on the Royal Navy. But the sailors knew that this attack would not have any impact on the outcome of the war. So, they began to mutiny. The mutiny failed, and hundreds of sailors were arrested for mutinying. But this act of disloyalty convinced German High Command that they would not be able to win the battle. And, at the end of October, they decided to call off the offensive. But they had imprisoned hundreds of sailors for mutiny, and now the people wanted those sailors back. Protests began. Their demands were anything from wanting the imprisoned sailors to be released to full-on socialist revolution. More and more sailors joined these protests, and troops were dispatched to put down the dissent. But the troops joined the side of the rebels. And with that, the death warrant of the German Empire had been signed. Do you know why? Because by morning, every ship in the fleet outside of Kiel would have a red flag flying over it. Poland, Austria, Alsace-Lorraine, Saxony and Bavaria would all declare independence. The German Empire and its administration was overthrown all over Germany. When the revolution reached Berlin, the Chancellor announced to the people that the Kaiser had resigned, even though he actually hadn't. But it was too late. The Kaiser fled to the Netherlands, and a new republic was proclaimed. The Allies signed an armistice with the new government and poured into the Rhineland, occupying a large chunk of the country and retaking Alsace-Lorraine. The German fleet was ordered to go to Scapa Flow to surrender to the Allies, and the Republic of Austria was dissolved. But on the 27th of December, a German soldier fired a shot into a crowd of Polish protesters. This was a big mistake, because with that one shot, he had just destroyed any and all hopes of Germany maintaining control of their Polish lands, because that was the spark that lit the fire that caused a rebellion to launch in German-Polish areas. Communist revolutions began in Bremen and Berlin, and the Bottleneck Republic was formed. The Bottleneck Republic was literally named that because it looked like the bottleneck between the American and French occupation zones. But here's the thing. The war in the West had been won. The war in the East was far from over. Germany, you have to go east and retake the Baltic states. Now. What? Why? Well, we can't let Soviet Russia retake the Baltic states now, can we? Come on, Germany. I'll save Estonia, you save Latvia and Lithuania. If the Russians won, they would have a clear shot straight to Berlin. But if Allied regimes could be set up in the region, then they would be able to cut off the Gulf of Finland and take control of Petrograd. The stakes were high, and everybody was ready to eat them. I didn't know where I was going with that one. I was sort of on a roll, and So the war continued. As the Red Army poured into the Baltic states, German and Polish forces went to stop them. The Royal Navy sent support to the Estonians, and on the 3rd of January, they halted the Soviet advance. Germany took the city of Riga in May, which is the capital of Latvia. Estonia wasn't comfortable with having the German forces that close to its border. So, a combined Latvian-Estonian force halted the German advance and retook the city. In March, a second communist revolution began in Berlin. This one, like the first one, failed. In Bavaria, the Würzburg Soviet Republic declared independence for 2 days before it got retaken by Bavaria. In the south, a communist government declared sovereignty, and the Civil War began. 8,000 troops of the Bavarian state met the Red Army in battle, but they were outnumbered more than 3 to 1. So every single Bavarian soldier either deserted or defected at the first shot of battle. And I heard the married soldiers did that as well. After this disastrous defeat, the Bavarian government had no choice but to call for help from the Freikorps. Now the Freikorps were this group of former German soldiers who'd been kicked out of the army after losing the First World War, had forced Germany to downsize its army. Now, the Freikorps were going down crushing communist revolutions all over Germany. They'd already put down 2 in Berlin and 1 in Bremen. Now, they'd been called in to support Bavaria. 20,000 Freikorps troops soon had Munich surrounded, and on the 2nd of May, they finally completed taking the city. On the 11th of May, the Freikorps retook Saxony. In August, Bavaria rejoined Germany. But the violence wasn't over yet. German attempts to retake Riga and parts of Lithuania had failed, so the armies of the newly independent countries had pushed them out of the Baltic states. Meanwhile in Silesia, 10 civilian protesters
were shot by German soldiers. And I think you know what happens next. Revolution. A Polish uprising began in Silesia against the Germans, which was quickly put down. But after the Treaty of Versailles went into effect in 1920, there would be 2 more Polish revolutions in Silesia, in 1920 and 21 respectively. Finally, the Allies were forced to divide Silesia between Germany and Poland, according to a plebiscite. Almost over now. Denmark was given free land from Germany, not because they fought in the war, but because the Allies wanted to punish Germany as hard as possible. There was a communist revolution in the Ruhr, which failed, and then Germany failed to pay its World War I reparations. So France and Belgium went into the Ruhr to start extracting those reparations, but by 1925 diplomatic pressure would force them out. Also, on the 25th of February 1923, the Bottleneck Republic, remember them, would be dissolved back into Germany. I bet you forgot all about them. Okay, where's my Guinness World Record for the fastest, biggest information dump in human history in like 5 minutes or however long this video is going to be? Like, comment, subscribe, goodbye. The year was 1918, and it had become clear that the Ottoman Empire could no longer win the First World War. So, they signed an armistice, and British troops marched triumphantly into the Ottoman capital city. But not everybody accepted the Ottoman defeat. The Ottoman Sultan did order all his troops to demobilise and submit to the Allies. However, many soldiers started refusing to surrender, and in fact organising in Anatolia. So the Ottoman Empire sent General Mustafa Kemal to deal with them, to get everything back in order. Mustafa Kemal told everybody that the Sultan had been captured by the Allies and that they had to liberate Turkey from the Allies. The Allies immediately told the Sultan to sack Mustafa, but it was too late, he'd already resigned. Loads of people in the region were throwing in with him. As the Allies forced the Ottoman Empire to sign a peace treaty, the new government Mustafa was setting up in Ankara did not recognise that peace treaty, and they were about to take back all the land they'd lost. A new state called Armenia had recently been created out of the former territory of the Ottoman and Russian empires. They were going first. A combined Turkish Bolshevik force hit the Armenians from both sides and completely squished them. The Greeks and the Italians had been bickering over who was going to get to claim which part of the Ottoman Empire, but that bickering ended when the Italians and French realised it really was not worth fighting, so they withdrew. But Greece wasn't giving up so easily. This was all the land that they had wanted from Turkey, and the Allies refused to recognise their claim to Constantinople, but a lot of the rest of it had been given. But the Greeks weren't just going to hold the land they'd been given and be done with it. No, they were going to overthrow the new government in Turkey, and they were going to march triumphantly into the city of Ankara. So they assaulted the Turkish positions at 2 great battles of İnönü, both of which they lost. Finally, they switched strategies and launched a third offensive. In this new third offensive, they sent part of their northern army to link up with the southern army and used the rest of the northern army as a diversion. They smashed through the Turkish lines and pushed forward. With that, all of western Anatolia was under Greek control, and they were planning their one final offensive to Ankara. A bunch of people high up in the Ankara government decided that Mustafa Kemal should be fully responsible for defending the city from the Greeks. The reason is they believed that the Greeks were definitely going to win at this point, so they should make sure that somebody else, Kemal, got the blame. But then, the Greek Prime Minister lost the election. Now here's the thing, the Greek Prime Minister had support from the Allies, France, Italy, Britain, but Greece itself did not. That's why when the new government voted to restore the king, Greece lost support from Britain, Italy and France. Meanwhile, Turkey was only gaining support. A combined Turkish-Soviet force invaded and partitioned Georgia. The Bolsheviks sent supplies to the Turkish regime, and Mustafa Kemal defeated the Greeks at the Battle of I can't remember the name. He pushed them back, and right as he was taking the final city, held by the Greeks, a massive fire started in the city and killed a lot of people, and we still don't know how the fire started. So with that, Turkey defeated Italy, Armenia, France, Greece. Who was left? Just the Ottoman Empire and Britain. They went for Constantinople, and the British gave up the city, leaving whatever was left of the Ottoman Empire to the mercy of the Turkish government. New borders were agreed upon, and Turkey was a thing. Subscribe, and like the video. In 1916, the Russian Empire inflicted a series of disastrous defeats on the Ottoman Empire, pushing them back and poising the Russians to strike deep into central Anatolia. However, the Ottoman Empire was saved by the February Revolution. The Russian government was overthrown, and all over Russia, the army mutinied. Pretty soon, the entire army was under the control of the soldiers, who began deserting in droves. The army was not an army anymore.
It was a bunch of armed peasants who wanted to go home and murder their landlord. This allowed the Ottoman Empire to push the Russian army back to the border. Now, Russia was going to need somebody to defend its southern border, and the Russian army simply wasn't going to cut it. Luckily, the Armenians in Russia did not want a repeat of the Armenian genocide in Russia, so they signed up in droves. As the Russians fled the battlefield, the Armenians occupied the tanks and guns that had been occupied by their former owners. Better yet, the person they appointed to lead the Armenian army was an Armenian nationalist who had fought 2 wars of independence against the Ottoman Empire. He'd been surrounded with 30 men against 1,200 men. He'd held out for 3 weeks before evacuating his entire force in the middle of the night, only losing 3 men in the process. The one catch was, it's probably not a good idea to put a guy in charge of the Russian army who's spent his entire life trying to get Armenia independent, you know? Feels like he might take advantage of that opportunity, but whatever, he was really good at his job. He was appointed to lead the army in December 1917. He held out for 4 months, until finally, in March 1918, he ordered a retreat to eastern Armenia, evacuating with him thousands of civilians. However, once the Ottomans invaded eastern Armenia, he defeated them again in 3 great battles. Meanwhile, the Trans-Caucasian Confederation and the Republic of the North Caucasus had declared independence from Russia. A slight problem, the Trans-Caucasian Confederation was getting invaded by the Ottoman Empire, and they were going to have some peace negotiations. Peace negotiations which would restore the Ottoman border to exactly what it was in 1878 before Russia took some of its land. However, this peace settlement would leave the Trans-Caucasian Confederation virtually defenceless, and it would also mean that Georgia and Armenia would have to cede some historically Georgian and Armenian lands, and they didn't want that. And you know who else didn't want that? Germany. Because if the Ottoman Empire could gain influence and control over the Trans-Caucasian Confederation, then that means Germany's plans for expanding into the Middle East and getting some oil would be severely hindered by the Ottoman Empire, who was their rival in the region. So Germany had to find a way of preventing this, and do you know what their plan was? Georgia! Are you sad about the fact that you're going to lose so much land to the Ottoman Empire? Yes. Well, I have the perfect solution for you. All you have to do is step 1, leave the Trans-Caucasian Confederation, and step 2, allow my troops into your country to defend against the Ottoman Empire, and so I can retake back all your land. Okay, so with that, Georgia left the Trans-Caucasian Confederation. 2 days later, a war began between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The Trans-Caucasian Confederation was at an end. The Caucasus had been balkanized. But remember Antonik? Well, now that Armenia had declared independence, you would think that Antonik would want to recognise the independence of Armenia. Incorrect. Antonik actually refused to recognise the Armenian independence because he believed that it should control all historically Armenian lands, and Armenia did not even claim all historically Armenian lands, so he refused to recognise this. Despite this, he still defended against foreign invaders. Using his troops, he held out against the Ottoman Empire and Azerbaijan. But then, slight problem. Oh no. There was a Bolshevik revolution in the city of Baku, and that means that all those lovely juicy oil was going to be wasted on the communists. And the Ottoman Empire wanted all that oil for itself. And similarly, Azerbaijan wanted Baku to be its capital city. So, they called in help from the Ottoman Empire to retake Baku. As Karabakh declared independence, Ottoman troops poured in before laying siege to the city. The offensive on the city began on the 30th of July, and on the 5th of August, they began their final attack to take the city. Hi, interjecting here, just like to make an apology. Animating Ben here. So, at this point, there was a country formed called the Provisional Dictatorship of Mugan, and it's about here. It's in the bottom right-hand corner of Azerbaijan. It's the grey bit. Anyway, I forgot to draw that country in. Just know that it is there. I forgot to draw it in. Okay, it's completely insignificant. It does nothing. It's a British puppet state that was designed to fight communism. Okay, that's it. It failed because the Bolshevik artillery kicked in at the last second. I'm not sure why the artillery wasn't already firing, but with the Ottoman attack repulsed, the Bolsheviks were overthrown by the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries, who called in the British for help. However, many of the defenders of Baku were Armenians, and the British didn't send a lot of troops to defend the city. The Armenians thought that they should send more troops. In fact, to quote one of my sources, the Armenians were dissatisfied with the size of the unit. On the 14th of September, the second attack on the city began. The exact same day, the British realised they were going to lose and withdrew. A day later, on the 15th, the city fell. On the 20th of September, 5 days later, the invasion of Dagestan began. However, it wouldn't last long. On the 30th of August, an armistice was signed between the British and the Ottoman Empire, forcing the Ottoman Empire to withdraw to their pre-1914 borders. On the 5th of November, the Ottomans set up the Kars Islamic Council to hold order in the region while they were gone. On the 8th of November, they occupied the city of Petrovsk, but they couldn't hold off the evacuation any longer, and they withdrew. As a matter of fact, Georgia and Azerbaijan were part of a British occupation zone. So on the 17th, the British returned to Baku and occupied the two countries. So then the Aras Republic declared independence. Anyway, moving on to 1919 now, the Russian White Movement of the Civil War conquers the Republic of the North Caucasus, and the North Caucasian Emirate is declared as a replacement to said country and a rebellion against the White Movement. The Mughal dictatorship is absorbed back into Azerbaijan. It was a British puppet state set up to fight against communism. The Karabakh Council was dissolved back into Azerbaijan. However, the Turkish War of Independence began, and the Bolsheviks wanted to help Turkey in their War of Independence. So, after defeating the White Movement, and after annexing the Emirate of the North Caucasus, they moved their troops through Azerbaijan to get to Turkey to help them get independence. And while their troops were in Azerbaijan, they decided they might as well annex the country anyway. Armenia would meet the same fate. Remember Antonik, who would refuse to recognise the independence of Armenia, but was still holding out against the Ottoman Empire and Azerbaijan? After both countries were occupied by the British, he decided that his work was done, and that Armenian independence had been secured. So he disbanded his unit. This was a bad idea, as in November 1919, a combined Turkish-Soviet force attacked from both sides and partitioned the country between them. And then over a year later, Georgia would meet the same fate as Armenia. Great news, this Saturday I am going to be doing a live-streamed Kahoot quiz. So the live stream's going to start with me reacting to my own video, this video, right? And then I'm going to do a Kahoot quiz live stream, okay, of all the information in this video. And so you just gotta, remember the information in this video. We'll see who is paying attention to this video, This is all going to be on the test, okay? Remember this. In 1895, China lost the war to Japan. Another in 57 long years of humiliations. Numerous cities, the entire Yangtze River, had been forced open to foreign trade. The USA had a permanent fleet stationed in the Yangtze to guard its own civilians. With this latest loss, China could only watch as the Republic of Formosa briefly declared independence before Japan conquered it. And several European countries took advantage of a now weakened China to force yet more concessions, with entire cities handed over to the European powers. When the Boxer Rebellion came about, and the China found itself at war with everybody, numerous provinces declared neutrality. China could no longer force its own people to fight for it. In 1903, when Britain wanted to negotiate with Tibet, they just casually sent an army in to meet the Dalai Lama. This is the story of China's century of humiliation. The story of how China fractured into 1,000 pieces, and the story of the piece that happened to win out over all the other pieces. You see, after a successful overthrow of the government in 1912, and a failed one in 1913 by the Kuomintang, there would be a third revolution in 1916. This revolution would force the president to resign, and China devolved into utter chaos. With central authority eliminated, there was 700 revolutions in China. By the end of the First World War, Japan was occupying the Chinese Eastern Railway, and China had fractured into several cliques, and the most powerful clique was called the Anhui, which controlled Tuva and Mongolia, and they jointly control the Beijing puppet government with the Zili clique. But then one day in 1920, the Zili clique tells the puppet president to sack the Anhui general that's occupied Mongolia and Tuva. The Anhui say, no, and boom, war's begun. The Fentian clique sides with the Zili, the Japanese side with the Anhui, but it's all over in a matter of days. The Zili clique defeats the Anhui in Mongolia and Tuva, which allows the White Army to come in and take over. Very briefly, because the Soviet Union comes in and takes them over. The Anhui has been defeated, and now the Zili clique shares power in China with the Fentian. But they don't like sharing power with the Fentian, so they defeat them as well. Boom. Now the Zili clique's in charge. So after being defeated in 1922, the Fentian immediately began plotting their revenge. They said, oh god, if only there was somebody who could help me get revenge on the clique that just betrayed me. And as a matter of fact, there was. Do you remember the Kuomintang mentioned earlier, failed rebellion in 1913? Well, they had just overthrown the Guangdong clique, and now they agreed to help the Fengtian. So, in 1924, when the Zili went to whatever was left of the Anhui and said surrender or die... Can anybody help me here? You see, the Zili just came to me and said something to the effect of surrender or die, And, can anyone help me? This is great! No, go back to them, say something to the effect of, never, we shall never surrender from you, you waste of space. And then, he's going to attack you. I'm going to use that as an excuse to invade him from the north, and then we'll fight him, from this guy. He's going to attack from the south. And not only that, but one of the key generals fighting for the Zili has agreed to mutiny and occupy Beijing from the Zili. So the mutinying general, the KMT, me and you, and we, are going to attack him from 4 sides and essentially just rip the Zili limb from limb. Feng Tian, where the heck is the KMT? Yeah, I was wondering that. Buddy, why aren't you doing your southern attack? We need you. Oh yeah, about that. So a guy called Chen is doing a revolution in the south, trying against us, so we're busy focusing on him right now. We can't possibly attack him in the south, you know, just... A Zili general whipped through his troops from the front and went back to occupy Beijing. He was staging a coup. The Zili not only had less troops on the front, but they had to send yet more troops away to fight the couing general. The Feng Tian had been plotting this revenge for 2 years. They'd made alliances with the KMT, the Anhui, and that mutinous general. With 3 friends, they knew that if one of them copped out, they would still have 2 other allies to attack with. And it had paid off. The Zili were left decimated, divided, and dislodged from the northern provinces. Meanwhile, the mutinous general conquered a bunch of land and named his new land the Guominjun. And then, the Zili clique and the Anhui clique teamed up and defeated the Guominjun. But the Zili clique isn't going to last much longer. Next up... Sorry, just thinking about it again. But the Zili clique isn't going to last much longer, because next up, the KMT has recovered from their rebellion. The KMT put together a coalition, and, with Soviet support, they pushed north and eliminated the Zili clique. They considered killing a bunch of their communist allies because they didn't trust them for some reason, but the Soviet Union said, if you purge all the communists, we'll cut off their support. And at that time, they still needed Soviet support. But then, they pushed it further, and within a few months, they weaned themselves off of Soviet aid and purged the communists from their ranks. This would result in the beginning of the Chinese Civil War in 1927, when the Chinese Communist Party began a series of revolutions against the Kuomintang. Meanwhile, Wuhan had separated from the KMT and declared that they were actually the government of the Kuomintang. And at that exact moment, the Guangxi comes in from the south and occupies Guangdong. They've turned on their KMT allies. The KMT defeats both of them, and at that point, more and more warlords in China recognize them as the legitimate government because they can see which way the wind is blowing. The Feng Tian, meanwhile, tries to take the railway from Soviet ownership. But then, 2 warlords suddenly decide that they're not allies of Chiang Kai-shek anymore and take Beijing from them. The KMT wins, of course, and then Feng Tian declares itself an ally of the KMT and occupies Beijing for them. Then a revolution begins in Xinjiang, and the Ma clique sends troops to help that revolution, and Guangdong rises against the Kuomintang. And then the Japanese come in and occupy Manchuria from Feng Tian, and Japan supports the rebels in Inner Manchuria, forcing the Chinese to concede large amounts of territory for them. The Chinese Communist Party finally gets encircled by the nationalists, but they break out and do a really long march to the north to escape. I mean, they even named it the Long March. The Soviet Union also intervenes and occupies Xinjiang. And boy, the leader of Xinjiang is not happy that his country is getting occupied by the Soviet Union. But there's nothing he can do about it, except spend multiple years plotting revenge against the Soviets. At this point, the situation in China is the north is controlled by the Soviet Union, the northeast is controlled by Japan, Tibet is independent, a large part of the western region is controlled by the Ma clique, everything else is either controlled by the nationalists or influenced by the nationalists. But you know the main reason that the KMT didn't bother to resist the Japanese conquest of Hebei? Because they were too busy trying to defeat the communists. But finally, the generals realised they have to focus on the Japanese. Alright, listen up, buddy Chiang. I know what your obsession is with fighting the communists, but there is currently a much greater threat to the Chinese nationalist movement than them. Japanese. God, I cannot believe when the Japanese threatened to occupy Hubei, you just gave it to them because you couldn't be bothered because you were too busy fighting the communists. If the communists were a threat, they would not have spent 9,000 miles running away from us. They literally named it the infamous Long March. Long March away from us because they're terrified. Just make an alliance with the communists, and they can help us fight the Japanese. We'll kick them out of China, and, hopefully to the curb. And then we'll turn on the communists and beat them. Now, in which case you're under house arrest until you agree.
which is just as well because the main Japanese invasion to take over all of China is finally coming. They land a naval force in Shanghai and launch an invasion down south from the north. Within a matter of months, Nanking, Wuhan, Beijing, Shanghai are all under Japanese control. Most of the Chinese population is occupied. At this point, the USA is still patrolling the Yangtze to protect Chinese citizens, but then Japan accidentally sunk a US ship, so, you know, the USA gets angry at Japan, but it doesn't lead to a war yet. There's a rebellion against the Soviets in Kazakhstan. The Soviets win. Finally, remember how I said that the leader of Xinjiang was not happy that he was being occupied by the Soviet Union? Well, in 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union began. Germany was at the gates of Moscow. So, the Xinjiang government takes an opportunity to take a leaf out of Stalin's book and does a purge. Any communist in a position of power is demoted. Japan pushes so far into northern China that they establish a land connection with India. However, they're not going to last much longer. The Soviet Union comes in from the north and occupies Manchuria. Then, with the American bombings on Japan, Japan surrenders, and China gets all their land back. Well, most of it anyway. The Soviet Union still has to decide what are they going to do with Manchuria, and they decide to give it to the Communist Party. And with that, the Communists begin their takeover of China. Pretty soon, it's almost all under their control. Whatever's left of the Kuomintang flees to places like Laos and Burma, where China actually has to go in and finish them off. A remnant of the KMT holds out until 1958. The rest escape to Taiwan, where they hold out to this day. And that is the story of how China collapsed and reunified, you know? The year was 1917, and the entire fate of the world was about to be decided in Russia. If the Communists won, Russia would become an enemy of the West and fight a multi-decade Cold War against them. If the Communists lost, however, Russia would be friends with the West for the foreseeable future. You see, starting in November 1917, almost every single major city in Russia suffered from a communist revolution. As city after city fell, Prime Minister Kerensky launched a doomed counteroffensive to retake his capital city. He was beaten back. But he wasn't the only person fighting the Bolsheviks. As it happened, so many people in Russia were willing to get together and fight communism tooth and nail. The Don and Orenburg Cossacks immediately declared independence. It took 2 weeks for Irkutsk to fall to the Bolsheviks before a man named Semyonov began his revolt. Ukraine, Finland, Transcaucasia, and Siberia all immediately announced sovereignty. With Romania invading, the continued war against Germany, and allied support for all the anti-communist organizations in Russia, it was going to be a difficult task for the Communist Party to stay in power. Luckily, they had a genius plan to drive Germany from their soil. They called it No Peace, No War. You see, the Bolsheviks couldn't win the Civil War and win the war against Germany at the same time, so they had to have peace talks with Germany to free up resources to win the Civil War. However, Germany's peace terms involved independence for the Baltic states, influenced, however, by Germany. This would give a permanent German presence right next to the second most important city in Russia. On top of that, the rest of the land they would have to cede was some of the most important land in Russia. It could bankrupt the country. Obviously, this peace deal could not be accepted. So, Trotsky came up with a new plan. America was shipping its troops to Europe to join the war against Germany. If these troops arrived in France, Germany would not have a chance of winning the war. Germany's only hope of victory was if it could defeat Russia, bring its troops round to France, and then defeat France and Britain before America showed up. If Russia demobilizes its entire army, Germany is left with a choice. It can continue its invasion of Russia and defeat Russia, but the invasion may take way too long, and America might arrive in time and defeat Germany. But if they instead move their troops away from Russia and hope Russia doesn't attack them, Russia might remobilize their army and attack them again. So, do you risk that Russia doesn't remobilize and attack you again? Go for Germany? Or do you risk that America will take too long to get there and go for Russia? Germany chose the former. Germany, I need your help. The Bolsheviks are about to take Kiev. No, they started in Kharkov, they've pushed all the way across the country. Oh, no, that's an update. Kiev has actually just fallen to the Bolsheviks. Our government has had to escape. Oh no, that's terrible. I hope you're going to be okay. Okay, would you like help fighting back against the Bolsheviks? Yeah, great. No, we'll fight them. Just, they're going down, you know? Flip, get them! A combined Austrian, German, Ukrainian force went back and retook Kiev from the Bolsheviks. The Red Guard was completely driven from the now undefended Ukraine, as Germany pushed as far as Rostov. With Ukraine a German vassal, they continued their offensive, occupying Belarus, the entire Baltic region, and were now ready and poised to occupy Petrograd, the capital city. They offered Georgia a deal. If you leave the Transcaucasian Confederation, they said to Georgia, we'll send troops to protect you from the Ottoman Empire. And Georgia accepted that deal. The Bolsheviks were forced to sign a much harsher peace treaty, ceding land in the Caucasus, along with Ukraine, the entire Baltic region, and Belarus. The no war, no peace strategy had ended in complete humiliation for the Bolsheviks. It was a disaster. But they were out of the war now. Germany could go fight France, and the Bolsheviks could now free up troops to go fight any remaining resistance. At this point, most of the counter-revolutionary forces in Russia had been overrun. They'd already overthrown the Kokand Autonomous Administration of Turkestan, and they'd seen some success against the Cossacks down south. All they really had to do now was finish off certain revolts like Yakutia and Semyonov's revolt. The next problem they have to deal with is the Czechoslovak Legion. The Czechoslovak Legion were, as you can imagine, a group of Czechoslovakian soldiers fighting for the Russians during World War I. However, after Russia dropped out of the First World War, they really want to get to the Western Front so that they can continue the war against Germany. They hopped on the train along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Their plan was to get to Vladivostok, where the Allied navies could then pick them up and ferry them back to France. From France, they could then march to Czechoslovakia. While they're travelling along the Trans-Siberian Railroad, something strange happens. Oh my god, look! It's a massive platform full of Czechoslovakians! Okay, so watch this, I've just got the best idea right now. Michael, open the window. Billy, hold my pint. Stephen, watch and learn. Here's one expert does. So, are you sure they're not going to be angry about this? What, buddy? They're not going to get angry about it. It was a harmless little prank, okay? Nobody's going to have to die over this. So, we've been getting reports that the Czechoslovakians have killed a Hungarian prisoner of war. Have they now? Well, we ain't having that. Let's go get them. So yeah, as you probably heard, we just arrested a bunch of your comrades for killing a Hungarian prisoner of war. So for the trial, would you like to come in and, be witnesses? Wait a minute, what are you doing? I thought we were going to be witnesses. Yeah, not anymore, buddy. You're also going to be a prisoner. Get in the jail cell. Hello, I've received reports that, multiple Czechoslovakians have been made prisoner by the local Soviet authorities. Is that correct? You're also under arrest as well. Get in the jail cell. Hi, I've been getting reports that, multiple Czechoslovakians have been made prisoners by local Soviet authorities. Is that correct? Yes, we have been arresting them, sir. Well, can you let them go? No, we cannot let them go. Yeah, that was a mistake. You shouldn't have said that. Yeah, no, I'm sure this was just a big misunderstanding. Alright? We can come to an agreement to this. Yeah. Just give us all of our comrades back, and we'll, we're square. It's peaceful now. Yeah, we're sorry, okay? We'll officially recognise that, your comrades are no longer our prisoners. We never have to fight again, okay? We'll shake on it, yeah. No, it's okay, Mr. Trotsky, sir. There was a slight kerfuffle, with the Czechoslovakians in Chelyabinsk. But it's okay. We worked out of it. The local Soviet authorities were able to come to an agreement with the Czechoslovaks. It's peaceful now. Most of the Czechoslovakian doesn't even know it happened. We're not at war with the Czechoslovaks. Oh, I'm sorry, did you say we weren't at war with the Czechoslovaks? Well, why not? I wish we were. Okay, this is exactly the opportunity we've been looking for. Okay, so, okay. Did you say they, forcibly liberated their comrades? Like, they went into jail and, busted their, friends out? Okay, so, we're gonna use that as our justification now. I'm gonna get the microphone to say this. I want every single member of the Czechoslovak Legion in Russia disarmed right this second and arrested. So Trotsky has ordered that the entire Czechoslovakian Legion be arrested and disarmed. Oh, I'm sorry. What did he do? He's ordered that the entire No, I heard you. I'm just curious as to why Trotsky thinks that he can just arrest us all like that. Why that midget Trotsky just wants to disrespect us like that? God damn it. He's screw no war, no peace. He's so ugly, they could have just used him to scare off the Germans. It's working with us. We're running out of Russia to France at full speed. Actually, no. They didn't have to scare them off. Just place them over the Dnieper River. The German army will never ever get across. But heck, what more do we expect from the mastermind behind the ingenious no war, no peace plan? You know what? That's it. Cancel those plans to leave Russia and order everybody to load their guns. We are order everybody to load their guns. We are going to... All along the Trans-Siberian Railroad, the Czechs and Slovaks rose up against the Bolsheviks, and pretty soon, this entire railway was under their control. And this inspired so many people to join the anti-Bolshevik movement, now known as the White Movement. The Allies sent their troops to land in both the north and the south. They also spent so many resources and supplies to support their allies against the Bolsheviks. The Provisional Government of Siberia was declared, and an organization known as the Komich declared itself the supreme highest authority in all of Russia. With so many anti-Bolshevik governments declared all across Russia, the Allies made them unite into the Provisional All-Russian Government, ready to kick this communist scourge straight to the curb. In the south, a volunteer army made up of Tsarist officers was formed to fight the Bolsheviks. They launched an attack to take the city of Ekaterinodar. They were outnumbered 3-1, but their soldiers were far more skilled than the Bolsheviks. Every single person told the general in charge, Kornilov, not to launch the attack. But he still insisted, no, we have to attack the city. The Battle of Ekaterinodar lasted 3 days. Finally, on the night before they planned to launch the final attack to retake the city, Kornilov was killed by one stray shell. And that one stray shell caused so much trouble for the Bolsheviks. If that shell had not killed Kornilov, the volunteer army would have attacked the city and failed, possibly being wiped out. Instead, Kornilov was killed, and all the sensible people ordered the attack to be called off. But, after making an alliance with the Kuban Cossacks, the volunteer army came back and took the city of Ekaterinodar, along with the city of Novorossiysk, and pretty soon, all the North Caucasus were under their control. They also made an alliance with the Don Cossacks, and pretty soon, all three of these groups united to form the armed forces of South Russia. And so now, there were three main groups of people all ready to take Moscow and win this war once and for all. The stakes were high, and everybody was ready to eat them. But there was a complication. With Germany defeated, that means that Ukraine had been able to redeclare independence, and Germany had also lost control of Belarus and the Baltic states. So now, a third front had been opened up. The Bolsheviks reinvaded Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltics. But the Allies told Germany to keep their troops in the Baltic states to prevent the Soviets from taking over. So Germany was back at war with the Soviets, as all three Baltic states declared their independence as volunteers from Denmark, Finland, Sweden all came to help them get that independence. The Royal Navy also went to Estonia to help them fight back against the Soviets. This had now become a major multi-front war, whose outcome would have as great an influence on history as the Great War did. Border skirmishes broke out between the Polish and the Russians, both of whom wanted to rule Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania, so obviously it's going to result in a war eventually. But Kiev fell to the Reds. The Don Cossacks, who had recently come under communist control, also rose up in rebellion against them. In March, both the main anti-communist groups began an offensive to defeat them. But by June, the White Russians in the east had been shoved back right over the Ural Mountains. In the south, however, communism would be less fortunate. A Ukrainian officer led a mutiny within the Russian ranks, causing their entire southern front to collapse. Soon, Crimea and most of Ukraine was under the control of the White Army. General Denikin, the leader of the Whites in the south, was at the height of his power, ruling over 40 million people, some of the most valuable lands in Russia, and was 300 miles away from Moscow. In the north, a third White Army was rising to take Petrograd. The Estonians, who had just helped Latvia retake Riga from the Germans, had allowed a man named Yudenich to wait in their country long enough to build up an army of 20,000 recruits. Then, in 1919, with support from the British, he stormed out of Estonia and made for Petrograd. With the White Armies losing on the Eastern Front, the British and the rest of the Allies decided to cut off support for Kolchak, who was leading the White Armies in the East. Instead, they concentrated their support on Denikin and Yudenich. Remember Yudenich? Not for much longer. The Bolsheviks dispatched military reinforcements to Petrograd, and by the time he arrived there, he was already outnumbered 3-1. The Red Army sent him packing, fleeing back across the border to Estonia. Estonia, on the other hand, decided to sign a peace treaty with the Bolsheviks, agreeing on a new border, recognizing their independence, and one of the peace terms was that Yudenich's army would have to be disarmed by the Estonians. So, as Yudenich crossed the border, his entire army was arrested and disarmed. The Ukrainian anarchist movement had split their alliance with the Bolsheviks and started fighting them, which, as well as the mutiny against the Bolsheviks, was another thing that made it easy for the Whites to storm Ukraine. Germany and the Bolsheviks had been pushed out of the Baltic region. An armistice had been signed with Poland, and Yudenich had been defeated. That freed up Bolshevik reinforcements to go down south. Meanwhile, remember those anarchists I mentioned earlier, who would split their alliance with Bolsheviks? Well, the Whites had pushed them back across the Dnieper River. But then, the anarchists suffered a stroke of luck. They ambushed one of the White cavalry detachments and won, obliterating the division. And they capitalised upon this opportunity, launching a full-on offensive with absolutely everything they had. They stormed their way right back across the Dnieper and managed to reach their way to the southern coast of Ukraine. I mean, the only coast of Ukraine, I should say. And they seized a large amount of the White supplies. With the White supply lines under threat, the Bolsheviks launched their own counterattack in the north, halting Denikin's advance. And with that, it was effectively the beginning of the end for the White Army. After that, there was no real hope of them winning. They were pushed back to the Caucasus, and Denikin launched one last-ditch offensive to retake the city of Tsaritsyn. It failed, and his army was all but eliminated. The Caucasian states, which had declared independence, would fall one after another. Azerbaijan was annexed, Armenia and Georgia would be partitioned with Turkey. The White survivors evacuated to Crimea, where they launched a final offensive into southern Ukraine, hoping that they could secure the harvest for that year. Poland also launched another invasion into Russia to take Kiev. But what's been going on in the east? Let's check up on them, shall we? A revolt had occurred in the city of Irkut in favour of Bolshevism. That meant that the leader of the Eastern White movement, Kolchak, was now cut off. But do you know who else was cut off? Our old friends, the Czechoslovakians. The Czechoslovakian Legion had been fighting the Bolsheviks all this time, and now they had just been surrounded by them, and they soon realised there was only one way they were going to get out of this alive. They arrested Kolchak and sold him to the Bolsheviks. In exchange, the Czechoslovak trains were allowed to move through Irkutsk. The remaining Czechoslovakians evacuated Russia, sailed all the way around the world, and finally marched through France to get to Czechoslovakia. They had been conscripted away from their homes to fight for the Austro-Hungarians in 1914. Then they'd been captured by Russia, fought against the Bolsheviks, and now they were home. Kolchak's remaining forces came under the command of a man named Semyonov. He had been fighting the Bolsheviks for a few years now, but now he was in charge of the entire Eastern Army. But he wouldn't last long either. The Japanese and Semyonov held out until 1921 before Japan decided it wasn't worth it anymore and cut off their support to him. He escaped to China, his armies were defeated. But when it looked like everything was going well for the Bolsheviks, their attack on Warsaw was a disaster. They were pushed back as Vilna in Lithuania fell to Poland, along with loads of the rest of Soviet Russia. The White armies hoped to link up with the Polish for another attack on Kiev, and eventually Moscow, but the Polish didn't really care. The Polish just wanted to gain a bunch of land. They weren't that bothered to overthrow the new regime. So they signed a peace treaty and annexed the large chunks of Ukraine and Belarus. That freed up resources for a combined anarchist-Bolshevik force to finally push the White side of Ukraine right before they got the harvest and occupy Crimea. And the White Army survivors evacuated to Istanbul. A massive peasant revolution known as the Green Armies would be crushed. The anarchists would be turned on and defeated. In 1921, the surviving members of the anarchist army realised that they were going to lose, and so they escaped to Romania. The sailors at Kronstadt mutinied, but they were put down in a couple of weeks. Finally, in 1923, the last action of the Russian Civil War would be fought. It was to fail the Yakut revolt against the Soviets. Finally, Russia was well and truly in Bolshevik hands. Sometime within the next week, there was going to be a live-streamed Kahoot quiz with questions about the information given in this video. So, make sure you remember the information in this video so you can get all the Kahoot questions right. I'll make a community post about when I plan to do the quiz. It's whenever I get the Kahoot quiz finished, really. Today, Saudi Arabia is one of the most significant countries in the world. It is the largest exporter of oil in the world, and it currently fights in the Syrian and Yemeni civil wars. It's also one of the very few countries in the world that doesn't claim to be democratic. In this video, we'll talk about how Saudi Arabia came to be so large, but also all the other things that happened in the Middle East during World War I. It's not a widely talked about topic on YouTube, therefore I think I should cover the Arabian fighting during World War I. The story starts in 1891, when the House of Saud was overthrown by the Emirate of Hayil, as the survivors fled to Kuwait. But the Kuwaiti prince gave them some weapons and some horses to retake their lost land. In 1902, 11 years after losing power, 68 men under the House of Saud would storm the city of Riyadh and retake the city from 80 Hayil defenders. The Saudis had retaken their capital city. It wasn't over though. Hayil would one day return and attempt to get revenge on the Saudis. For now, what was left of Hayil came under the domination of the Ottoman Empire. Speaking of the Ottomans, you'll never guess who the Saudis' next target was. Now you may be wondering how such a tiny country could possibly take on the might of the Ottoman Empire, even if they were known as the sick man of Europe. Look at the size comparison, except for a tiny part that wasn't even properly connected to the rest of the Ottoman Empire, so that the Ottoman Empire couldn't even get any reinforcements to that part when Saudi invaded. Oh wait! The Ottoman Empire couldn't get any reinforcements to that part when Saudi invaded. So, right before World War I began, as the Ottoman Empire lost control of Libya, the Balkans, and almost lost Constantinople to Bulgaria, Saudi marched in and occupied part of the southern territories of the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottomans wouldn't have much time to do anything about it though, because World War I had begun, and they were a part of it. The Ottomans had been losing ground in Arabia for a while now. Yemen had declared independence, and they had been forced to make significant concessions to bring Yemen back under their control. And similarly, and by the way I know this is an Ottoman, the British had lost control of Oman as they had asserted their independence. This war would be an opportunity for even more independence movements to spring up. Asir declared independence. Remember how earlier in the video I talked about how Hayil would seek revenge? Yeah, my prediction was right. How on earth did I know? 15 to 1800 forces from Hayil invaded Saudi Arabia with the support of the Ottoman Empire. The Saudis had the support of the British and 2,000 men, so they outnumbered Hayil. And despite this, it was a disaster. 600 Saudis were lost that day, and one of those 600 casualties was a British military advisor sent to them, a British military advisor known as William Shakespeare. So after a bunch more countries declared independence and the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the Sauds decided to invade Kuwait. This wouldn't work, however. The British and the Kuwaitis managed to stop them. Iraq attempted to overthrow their British conquerors. They failed. Newly independent Syria ended up at war with the French and lost. The Al-Mutari tribe became effectively a puppet of the Sauds. The Ikhwan tribe, living in Saudi Arabia, launched a series of raids against Jordan, and Jordan had to be saved by the British. Finally, the House of Saud decided it was probably a good idea to take over the rest of Arabia and get themselves a southwestern coast. So between 1924 and 1925, they invaded the Kingdom of Hejaz, which had declared independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1916. It fell very quickly. Then between 1925 and 27, the Syrians launched a failed independence war against France. They lost, but yes, with the fall of Hejaz, most of the Arabian Peninsula, except for the British-controlled territories in the south, was under Saudi Arabian control. Yes, there will be a Kahoot quiz on this one, so take some notes. The First World War is often covered at length. What we don't normally talk about is the massive revolution that happened in Russia during the First World War, at the exact same time as many major events in World War I were happening. You see, during the First World War, many groups of people in Russia were exempt from getting conscripted. For example, the people of Finland, and also the Islamic population of Russia. However, in 1916, the Russians decided they needed some extra troops, so they told the Islamic population of Central Asia that they were no longer exempt from conscription. This enraged them, and a massive revolution began in modern-day Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. Large Russian forces had to be drawn away from the front to put down this revolt. Thousands were killed, thousands more fled to China. However, there is one statistic that I have not yet included in this video, because I am skeptical of it. The statistic that 40% of the Kyrgyz population died during this revolt. If you want to hear me examine the evidence, and, judge whether or not I think it's true, then you can click on this video up here. You may not have realised this, but Bulgaria indirectly caused the First World War. They fought in the Balkan War, and this all but drove the Ottoman Empire from Europe. And this also doubled Serbia in size and made it a much more powerful nation, to the point where Austria-Hungary considered it a mild threat. This convinced Austria to take the first opportunity they could to attack them, and this resulted in the empire's downfall. This means that Bulgaria's actions caused World War I. Recent history as we know it would not have happened without Bulgaria. In this video, I'll describe the creation of Bulgaria, its role in both world wars, and how its history played out up until today. For hundreds of years, Russia has lusted for the extremely valuable port of Istanbul. They've been trapped in the Black Sea for their whole history, dreaming of getting access to the Mediterranean. And now, in the 1870s, they had an opportunity, they'd get it. Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and most importantly Bulgaria were in open rebellion against the Ottoman Empire. But the Bulgarian uprising was crushed via brutal atrocities, inspiring massive sympathy for the Bulgarians all across Europe, and especially in Russia. This is the opportunity we've been waiting for to get a coastline on the Mediterranean Sea. We'll go to Bulgaria, kick out the Ottomans, and create the state of Bulgaria, which will lease their ports to us. And better yet, we can conquer Constantinople and bring the Turkish state to an end. It's genius. Jim, tell Austria-Hungary they can have Bosnia if they don't intervene. Jake, get the troops ready. We're going to win. Sir, telegram from Moscow. The Russians want permission to move their troops through our territory to attack the Ottoman Empire. This is the opportunity we've been waiting for. We'll wait until the Russian troops are between us and the Ottoman army, and then we'll declare our independence. At this point, Montenegro and Serbia were losing their wars against the Ottoman Empire, but then Russian troops stormed into Bulgaria, and everybody launched offensives against the Ottomans, as Russia opened a second front in the Caucasus. In the Balkans, the Ottoman defences began holding out against the pro-Russian coalition at the city of Plevna. Russia, Romania and Bulgaria brought 130,000 troops to take Plevna. 67,000 Ottoman troops defended the position. Nobody knew it at the time, but this battle may have extended the existence of the Ottoman Empire by 4 decades. Meanwhile, 2 Russian assaults were made on the Shipka Pass. The Ottomans repulsed these attacks before evacuating. They sent an army to relieve Plevna, but to get to Plevna, they had to first retake the pass. 30,000 Turks assaulted just 5,000 Russians, who soon, through reinforcements, swelled to 11,500 defenders. Russia would take 3.6 to 4,000 casualties, while the Ottomans took 10,000. But Russia held the pass. With reinforcements, the Ottoman army once again attacked what was left of the Russian garrison of the Shipka Pass, which had received no reinforcement. Once again, Turkey lost, suffering 3,000 casualties. Plevna held out for nearly 5 months against Russia's coalition, reducing the attackers to just 80,000, but their entire force was captured. This freed up Russian forces to attack and take Sofia. They then swung round and launched the 4th battle of the Shipka Pass, and surrounded the Ottoman army, who were outnumbered 2 to 1. The defending force surrendered. Russia suffered only 5,000 casualties during that battle. Pretty soon, 4 new countries had secured independence from the Ottoman Empire. The invading army lost 50,000 men at Plevna. It has been argued that had those 50,000 casualties not been taken, Constantinople would have fallen, and the Ottoman Empire's existence would have been cut short by 40 years. Instead, the invading coalition was too weak to continue the offensive, and was forced to sign an armistice. Serbia, yes, enjoy your independence. Montenegro, yes, enjoy your independence. And finally, Bulgaria, lease me the ports. The ports on the Aegean Sea, lease me them. So with that, Russia had achieved its dream of access to the Mediterranean. Or had it. You see, Britain didn't appreciate that a Russian puppet, Bulgaria, was so powerful. Luckily, there was someone they could reach out to for help. Russia had promised Austria Bosnia if they didn't intervene on the side of the Ottoman Empire. They had yet made no move to give Bosnia to Austria. It also surfaced that Russia believed they had only conceded part of Bosnia. Austria wanted it all. Britain told Austria that if they supported the reduction in size of Bulgaria, Britain would support Austrian control of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So with that, Bulgaria shrunk massively to an autonomous region and a semi-autonomous region. Russia, whose armies were exhausted and couldn't fight another war, was forced to agree. However, Turkey never reoccupied eastern Rumelia. In 1855, when Bulgaria announced with British support that they were annexing the province, the Sultan could do nothing about it. However, Bulgaria was still really sad about losing all its land. Luckily for Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire had shown signs of not being militarily strong. In 1911, Italy came in and took over some islands and Tripolitania. The Balkans realised that they could just invade the Ottoman Empire and win easily, so they did. Bulgaria came within pooping distance of Constantinople, but the Ottomans stopped the attack by the skin of their teeth. But Bulgaria felt it was owed something. They had contributed the most troops of any country to the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, but Greece and Serbia still refused to give up any of the land they conquered. So Bulgaria invaded Serbia. But when it looked like things were going well, Greece said, if Serbia falls, I might be next. And I don't want to be next, so I'd better stop Bulgaria. So Greece invaded Bulgaria. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire realised This was a perfect opportunity to retake some lost land, so the Ottoman Empire invaded, and then Romania realised that there was absolutely not a single Bulgarian soldier standing between them and the capital Sofia. So Romania decided, well, why shouldn't I just invade? And Romania invaded. Bulgaria was carved up as 4 different countries each took a slice of their land. However, Bulgaria would soon get a chance to get that land back. How much? How much? I think I can do... Here's your check, Austria. What? This is blank. Serbia was soon at war with Austria, and Bulgaria came in from the other side and took Macedonia. Romania joined, and Bulgaria took southern Dobruja. Greece joined, and Bulgaria took some land. But the Allies launched an offensive, won, and once again, Bulgaria was carved up. However, when they won the war, the Allies made a mistake that would come back to haunt them. Alright, Italy, here is your victory. Did you let your dog chew on this or something? This victory looks mutilated. In 1940, Italy offered Bulgaria land in Greece in return for help in their invasion of the country. Bulgaria refused, and Italy failed in their attack. Germany then said, let our troops pass through or be invaded. Bulgaria joined on and was given parts of Greece and Macedonia to occupy. Germany even forced Romania to give them southern Dobruja. Near the end of the war, Bulgaria would be forced by the Red Army to switch sides. They were forced to hand back almost all their gains, except for southern Dobruja. For the next 40 years, Bulgaria would be a Soviet vassal, until finally, in the late 20th century, the Eastern Bloc would collapse, bringing Bulgaria to the place that it's in today. On the 1st of November 1914, Persia declared that it was neutral in the Great War that had just started. The great powers of Europe responded by telling Persia that it should be a stand-up comedian, because that was the funniest joke they'd ever heard. Russia had been occupying northern Persia since 1909, and at the start of World War I, Persia came to Russia and said, hey, leave our country. Russia said no, the Ottoman Empire used the Russian presence as a pretext for an invasion of Persia, and in they went. For the duration of the war, the 3 great powers surrounding Persia would use it as a battlefield, fighting their battles on Persian soil, with the Persians barely able to resist. German agents would enter the country to convince the local tribes to revolt against the British. Finally, in 1917, decades of foreign occupation and abuse would finally culminate. The British had been seizing grain and supplies from the Persians and taking their food, or even destroying crops to deprive the enemy tribes of them. This, along with bad harvests, caused the Great Persian Famine of 1917 to 1919. This famine occurred at the same time that several different epidemics hit the country, including the Spanish flu and cholera. 2 million members of the Persian population died within these 2 years. Yet, many people don't know anything about this tragedy. Only half of you guys know about it, and nobody I've spoken to has heard of it. According to one paper, they don't even teach about it much in Iran today. In this video, we'll talk about the history of Persia before, during and after World War I, to learn about a major front in a major war that doesn't get talked about enough. And we'll learn about how 20 to 50% of the Persian population was wiped out in just a couple of years. We'll start in the 19th century. If you're watching this video, you've probably already heard of the unequal treaties signed with China and Japan. Persia met a similar fate. A country, previously isolated from the global economy, was forced into it by foreign powers at gunpoint, extracting concessions, forcing unfair deals, and gaining influence in the country, taking control of railways, banks, telegraphs, roads, insurance, etc. And a government that gives up too many concessions to foreign powers will become unpopular with the people. In Japan, that resulted in the Meiji Restoration. In China, the Boxer Rebellion. And in Persia, the Constitutional Revolution. It started in 1904 when an economic crisis hit Persia. You see, Russia had ended up at war with Japan, and so couldn't trade as much with Persia. This resulted in inflation in Persia. The price of bread rose 90%, the price of sugar rose 33%. So the Shah had to take out a loan from Britain and Russia, to which they were already £4 million in debt. The foreigners gave that loan, under the condition that Belgian administrators be given control of the entire customs system. So Persia was now in the difficult position of being deeply in debt to foreigners, and the people in charge of paying off that debt were foreigners, who had promised the other foreigners that they would prioritise paying off the debt. So the people of Persia were furious. In the 1890s, the Persian government had tried to give control of all tobacco in the country to the British. Massive protests had sprung up and forced the Shah to undo the deal. In 1905, with Russia too busy fighting a revolution and being humiliated by Japan to worry about Persia, the people of Persia wondered if they could replicate the success of the tobacco protests over a decade later. In late 1905, the government attempted to enforce tariffs in Tehran. The merchants didn't like this and went on strike. The situation rapidly escalated and protests began all over the country. It had not taken much to tip the resentful Persian society over the edge. The protesters forced the Shah to give up some of his power to a House of Justice, full of representatives of the people. The Shah promised that Persia was now a democracy. After thousands of years of absolutism, Persia had finally become a state run by representatives of the people. However, the Shah didn't keep his promise. In mid-1906, nationalist leaders were exiled, and a leading cleric was arrested, which the Shah wasn't allowed to do. Student protesters tried to free the cleric, but one of them was killed by Cossacks. His bloody shirt was raised above the protesters as a martyr, and protests sprang up once again. The Shah was forced to approve a new constitution, giving away even more of his power to democratic institutions, and soon after that, he died. His successor, Muhammad Ali Shah, rose to the throne in 1907, determined to retake full control of the country from the revolutionaries. And soon, it looked more and more like he would be able to do so. In 1907, the British and Russians divided the country into two zones of influence, with a neutral zone in between. The collaboration between the two countries allowed them to bully the government more than ever before. Then the Liberals and the Marshals, that was the name of the new government, made a series of unpopular finance reforms. They also advocated certain reforms like equality for women, religious equality, and importantly, criticised the fact that the clergy, known in Persia as the ulama, was able to veto any parliamentary legislation they liked. Sheikh Nuri, a high-ranking religious figure, was furious at this. He formed the Society of the Prophet, started to build good relations with the Shah, and denounced the liberals for building the way to anarchism, socialism, nihilism, and naturalism. He held a rally to demonstrate his popularity, and he filled up the whole of Cannon Square, and his fiery language caused people wearing European-style hats to get attacked on the streets. All this led to the Shah believing that the parliament had become unpopular enough for him to stage a coup and retake power. In December 1907, the same month that Sheikh Nuri held a rally, the Shah occupied Tehran and took control of the city. But it soon became clear that he didn't have enough support, so the Shah backed down. Democracy had been saved, and they all lived happily ever after. But the Shah wasn't going to give up that easily. In 1908, someone threw a bomb at his car. Muhammad Ali survived the attack, but it left him even more determined than ever to restore the monarchy to its full power. In June 1908, he received a donation of £10,000 from the Ministry of Posts, a figure worth over $1 million today. He divided that 10 grand among his 1,500 Cossacks, before leaving the city just in case things went awry. His Cossacks and soldiers occupied the telegraph office, and surrounded the Parliament building along with the Sefer Salam Mosque, and 6 Cossack artillery pieces opened fire on the compounds. During the battle, the nationalist defenders charged out of the defences and took out half of the Cossack artillery. Additionally, 400 of the attackers deserted rather than face the nationalists. Even with these victories, the defenders were still outnumbered, and so they fled the compounds. Some of the marshalless deputies were captured, but most either escaped abroad or escaped into the Ottoman consulate. Meanwhile, fighting broke out between the nationalists and the monarchists in Tabriz. The nationalists won and the royalists besieged the city. So, with Tehran under control and Tabriz under siege, it looked, for a brief moment, like the Shah would succeed in taking control of the country. Democracy had been defeated, and absolutism had been restored. But then, the leader of the royalist army decided he didn't want to be the leader of the royalist army anymore. He wanted to be the leader of the nationalist army. So he switched sides and took a lot of his forces with him. The royalists did manage to keep up the siege of Tabriz, but such a massive defection hurt them greatly. Volunteers from both Persia and abroad volunteered to join the nationalist army against the Shah, and crucially, the Bakhtiari tribe sided with the nationalists. The tribe marched into Isfahan and kicked the royalists out. Russia came in and restored peace to Tabriz. And, after 12 months of civil war, the nationalists and Bakhtiari came in on the capital as the Shah fled to the Russian embassy. He eventually left the country forever and never came back, just like Napoleon did. The Bakhtiari also gained a lot of influence in the new government because of the role they had in taking the capital. Muhammad Vali Khan, the commander of the Qajar army that had defected, also became Prime Minister and Minister for War. A regent was installed for the new Ahmed Shah. The nationalists had won. But not all was well in Persia. The Cossack unit, under the Russian commander Lyakov, who had both started the Shah's coup and been the last unit to surrender, was allowed to remain in service to the new government. And, when rioting and looting became a threat, the government realised most of the tribal levies had gone home, and the old Qajar army wasn't an effective fighting force. So, they called in the Cossacks to restore order. Political divisions also made it difficult to consolidate the new government. There was even a rebellion in one province against the Bakhtiari's growing influence. Worse, the British and Russians, the people who had arguably started this whole mess, continued opposing and blocking any action that could limit their influence. This, combined with the economic problems of a year-long civil war, demonstrated that things weren't exactly perfect in the country. So the Persians decided to call in an American to fix their problems. William Schuster was an American who had worked as an official in the US military government in Cuba when the US occupied the country. Then he had worked in the US Filipino government when the US occupied that country. And now, the US recommended him to the Persian government. In early 1911, Schuster was made the Treasurer General of Persia, and he said, "This is the most appalling shambles I've ever seen. No wonder you have no money. Half the government budget goes to the army. Apparently we have foot soldiers to pay. Well, foot soldiers my foot, because I've never seen a substantial group of soldiers except when they're asking for more money. They don't do anything, they just sit around and wear a uniform. The War Department says they have 200,000 men apparently, but the amount of disciplined soldiers in the country amounts to less than 8,000 men. Hey Schuster, the War Department needs more money. Hey Varley, your brain department needs more cells. Don't worry, I have a plan to fix this. Find me the most patriotic and country-loving men in the entirety of the army. We're going to put together an attachment of men so loyal, they would happily die for their country without a second thought. Why? Well, as of the late 1890s, an estimated 80% of Persia's revenue comes from the land tax. But the problem is, many landowners, such as landlords and tribal leaders, often don't feel like paying taxes. So they don't. I want to put together a force known as the Treasury Gendarmerie, an elite unit that can enforce tax collection all over the country, and ensure the government has enough money. But, while Schuster was trying to fix the economy, do you remember earlier how I compared Shah Muhammad Ali to Napoleon? Well, because of that, some of you can probably guess what happens now, but Muhammad Ali is back with a literal boat full of ammunition. In 1911, he landed in Persia and swung many of his former troops and some tribes back to his side. Then, he defeated the nationalist forces in an initial battle, securing more recruits, resources, and 2 cannon. This was a genuine threat to the constitutional government. They had 1,800 fighting men in Tehran, but they were needed to keep order in Tehran. To make things worse, Muhammad Ali's brother took 800 cavalry to Kyrgyzstan to drum up support there, to make a westward push on the capital. Another defeat was reported. 56 miles from the city, the royalists sent the nationalists packing. Luckily, the nationalists did have 700 troops in the city of Kazvin, and the Bakhtiari tribe, still ready to fight for the nationalists, put together 600 volunteers to defend the capital. On September 5th, 1911, almost 1,200 nationalists met 2,000 royalists at the Battle of Varamin. The battle opened with the royalists sending in a diversionary attack of 300 fighters. In response, the defenders pulled up a Maxim gun and 3 artillery pieces and opened fire on the diversionary force, then sent in the cavalry. The diversion was routed and sent straight back into the main army, scattering the tribal forces. The Battle of Varamin was a nationalist victory. Further north, the Shah was ambushed and sent fleeing. His brother, meanwhile, had been able to recruit a force of 6,000 men. But when they were met in battle by an army of just 2,000 opponents, they were defeated. But this victory provided no respite to the government. Soon, it turned out that this country was still incredibly weak and subservient to foreign powers, because Russia began threatening to invade the country, and they sent an ultimatum that, among other things, would remove Schuster from power and give Russia de facto dominion over the northern territories of Persia. The Persian parliament tried to resist the ultimatum, but the Persian Prime Minister believed they had to accept the ultimatum to avoid a Russian invasion. So he sent in the troops to dissolve Parliament and allow himself to accept the ultimatum before the country got occupied more than it already was. So a full Russian occupation had been averted, but the Russians continued to occupy Tabriz. And the Russian occupation of Tabriz was brutal. They purged 3,000 nationalists to maintain their power, and when 1 Russian soldier was murdered, Russia responded by executing 43 people. In Tehran, the Bakhtiaris had taken control of government institutions, and the other tribes were ignoring the government's authority, raiding villages and withholding taxes. In the south, tribes formed an alliance to curb the growing Bakhtiari influence. So, with Schuster gone and his gendarmerie dissolved, the Persian government had to fix the country by themselves. The Russians had just forced them at gunpoint to dissolve the gendarmerie, so the Persian government came up with a cunning plan. Their plan was to rebuild the gendarmerie. They were going to put together a force that could maintain order, collect taxes, and prevent tribal revolts, and they called it the Government Gendarmerie, and they recruited all the old members from the Treasury Gendarmerie into the Government Gendarmerie, and they called in 36 Swedish officers to train the unit, and soon, things started to look up for the country. By 1914, the gendarmerie had over 10,000 men, and they were putting down tribal revolts. In fact, foreign influence in the country actually began to wane, partly because British and Russian relations began to break down, and because Schuster's financial reforms succeeded in significantly reducing foreign debt. The Cossack Brigade even began to lose power and fade into insignificance. Sure, there were still problems. There weren't enough gendarmerie to crush every tribal revolt, so sometimes the government still had to negotiate with the rebels or call in the help of other tribes. And let's not forget that the army mainly only existed on paper, with even officers sometimes having to work second jobs as shopkeepers just to make enough money to get by. The Bakhtiari also still had a lot of control, and they prioritised their tribe over the state. However, more good news arrived in early 1914, when, despite the best efforts of foreign powers, Persia still managed to hold an election for their government, and they had a very high voter turnout. Things were definitely improving in the country. Persia! This is important! Someone better have died. Funny you should mention that. Did you hear what happened in Sarajevo? At the moment when Persia was finally improving, the worst thing that could possibly have happened decided to happen. World War I began. Much of the progress Persia had made was undone overnight by the outbreak of the First World War. All three of the surrounding powers had been occupying parts of Persia for years, so it would be virtually impossible for Persia to remain out of the conflict. The Ottoman Empire launched a surprise offensive to take Tabriz, but a quick Russian counter-offensive retook the city. The Persian state, with no sufficient means to defend itself from outside interference, had been reduced to nothing more than a battleground for warring powers to fight over, and it made the people of Persia really angry. You see, the Ottoman Empire had declared jihad against the British, and many in Persia heeded that call, with assaults on British positions. On top of that, the Germans also began sending agents into Persia to stir up the tribes against the British. They did have some success in inciting attacks, assassinations, and raids on the British and Russian occupiers. The Germans even spread rumours that the Kaiser had converted to Islam, and that the German race originated from the province of Kerman in Iran. But the British response and crackdown was brutal, and the Germans were looking to target a much bigger fish. They wanted the government of Persia to issue a declaration of war on the Allied powers. They began entering into negotiations with the Persians for the conditions on which Persia should join the war. However, something threw a wrench in their plans. Rumours spread, and the Allies found out. Iran was preparing to become a central power. Russia reinforced their positions in Kazvin, before getting ready for an occupation of Iran's capital city to bring the country under control. On November 7th, 1915, 30 Democratic politicians, accompanied by several moderate politicians and some journalists, fled the city and regrouped at Qom. There, they declared the Provisional Government of Iran and declared war on the Allied powers. They received the support of the gendarmerie and thousands of volunteers. The gendarmes seized numerous major cities across the country, taking British assets and arresting their civilians. They were going to finally stand up to the bullies and kick these evil interlopers out of their country once and for all. But not if the 60 to 80,000 Russians in the country could stop them. 4,500 Persians ended up having to defend a front against 1,500 Russians. They held on throughout early December, but, despite German support, were eventually defeated, and Hamadan fell. Qom was evacuated, and the provisional government fled to Kashan and then Kermanshah. You may think that after so many defeats, the provisional government would struggle to get support. But you'd be wrong. Two foreign powers had been economically and militarily abusing Persia for decades. Suddenly, someone was finally doing something about those pesky imperialists. 4,000 to 5,000 more people flocked to join the provisional government's cause, to join 3,000 gendarmes already defending the approaches to Kermanshah. Despite this, the Russian attack kept up, and in late February 1916, Kermanshah fell as well, and the nationalists fell back to Kazir-e-Shirin. Initially, Russia hadn't planned to continue the attack, but then the British got surrounded in the town of Kut. Britain said, "Russia, I need you to attack Baghdad to draw their forces away from Kut." So, Russia began plotting an invasion into Iran. But to do that, they would have to further weaken the nationalist forces in Iran. So, 7,500 Russian troops and 20 guns attacked the Paytak Pass. The gendarmerie held on for a month, suffering 50% casualties before retreating. Still, they delayed the Russian offensive long enough that Kut had already fallen, forcing the Russians to call off their attack on Baghdad. The provisional government fled to Baghdad, leaving the country defeated. Of course, the nationalist cause never gave up. The tribes kept rebelling against the British, and the gendarmes maintained control over small parts of Iran. In fact, at one point the tribes had so much success that they drove Britain almost from the entirety of southern Iran before the British responded and retook the territory. During 1916, the nationalist government returned with Ottoman support, but pretty soon they were forced back into Turkey, where the movement fizzled out. Soon, in 1917 and 1918, two of the three major powers surrounding Iran collapsed, and so Persian anger was directed solely at the British. Shia mullahs even began issuing orders authorising the murder of anyone caught working with the British. And speaking of 1917, those of you with a good memory will remember what began in 1917, the Great Persian Famine. You see, in retaliation for the attacks on British positions by the tribes, the British cracked down hard, seizing food or forcibly buying it at a low price, and capturing farm animals to supply their war effort. Bad harvests also hit the country at the same time. This caused the Great Persian Famine to occur. At the exact same time, the Spanish flu and a wave of cholera hit the country. This 2-year period would see the deaths of millions, and it was the single lowest point in Iran's history. But the thing about famines is they don't just affect those who die, they affect the survivors and the survivors' families forever. When interviewed about the situation, a 70-year-old Iranian teacher said, "I remember when my mother narrated those days. For many years she always asked us to be sure that we had enough bread at home. She always bought too much wheat and stored it in the house. She was afraid of hunger. She was afraid of death from hunger. She was the only survivor of a big family. She lost her siblings and many family members during the Great Persian Famine and cholera. She did not like to refer to the memories of those days, but we could see the effects of famine in all parts of her life."
In August 1919, Britain forced Iran to submit to a British protectorate over the country. At this point, almost the entire Persian army was dependent on British funding. After winning the Russian Civil War, the Bolsheviks returned to the north of Iran and encouraged the creation of an independent country of Azerbaijan, but that was retaken quickly. However, the Red Army still managed to install a communist regime in Gilan. But at this point, I want to introduce a new character to our story, Reza Khan. He was a member of the Persian Cossack unit. Remember them? He joined the Cossacks at 14 and taught himself to read, and by this point, he was a prominent member of the Cossacks. In 1920, the British had decided that it wasn't worth continuing to occupy Persia, and had announced that during 1921, they would be leaving. But the British had a problem, and that problem was a guy called Staroselsky, in charge of the Persian Cossacks, and leading their counterattack against the Bolsheviks. And he was a white Russian. In 1918, the British had helped him gain his position in the Persian Cossacks. Now, the British had to remove all white Russians from positions of power in the country, allowing them to maintain their influence. And so, Staroselsky had to go. Staro had seen some success fighting the communists in the north, but eventually, a unit of demoralised Cossacks routed, and the British used that as an excuse to remove Staro and put Reza Khan in as deputy leader of the Cossacks. But effectively he was the actual leader of the Cossacks. This was the beginning of Reza Shah's rise to power. He wouldn't stop until he was in control of everything. First, with British approval, he staged a coup, marching into Tehran with no resistance, and declaring himself commander of all armed forces in Persia. Then, he declared that he was the war minister, and absorbed the gendarmerie under the control of the war ministry, which was him, because apparently being commander of all armed forces in Persia doesn't give you command of the gendarmerie, apparently. Either way, Reza Khan immediately undid the Anglo-Persian agreement and removed all British influence from the country. Then, he signed a deal with the Bolsheviks, getting them out of the country. For the first time in seemingly forever, Persia was free of foreign forces. One of his subordinates rebelled against him in Mashhad, but he was defeated by a Kurdish militia. All that was left to do after that was crush the breakaway groups. Gilan was defeated, its leader killed in a snowstorm, his head sent to Tehran. Kurdistan was retaken. The southern provinces, which had declared independence, were also soon retaken. In 1925, the figurehead Shah died, and Reza Khan declared himself the actual Shah of Iran. He was now ruler of absolutely everything.